She was never supposed to be in that room. The wrong corridor, the wrong door. One breathless, terrified moment of reaching for a man who had never truly seen her. And instead she found the king. Not the prince. Not the careful, smiling illusion she had built her whole quiet life around. The man who ruled by silence. The man who needed no permission to take up space in a world that bent around him like iron cooling around a blade. Drop your city name in the comments right now and tell me, have you ever walked through the wrong door and felt the ground shift beneath you? Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens inside these palace walls will remind you that destiny has never once asked for your consent. Like this video if you've been waiting for a love story that doesn't flinch. The Palace of Valderis did not sleep. That was the first thing Elira Voss had understood as a girl, crouched beside her mother in the lower healing corridors while candlelight flickered against cold stone walls. Even at midnight, boots struck the flagstones somewhere above. Even before dawn, voices sharpened in the war chambers. The palace breathed like a living thing. Unpredictable, restless, always aware of itself. And those who lived inside it learned quickly that stillness was not the same as safety. Elira had spent 22 years mastering the particular stillness that kept her invisible. She knew which staircases the royal guard preferred on their evening rotations. She knew that the third-floor eastern corridor smelled of old pine and beeswax because Lord Aldrich insisted on it, and nobody denied Lord Aldrich anything. She knew that the kitchen boys finished their work by the second bell, and that the passage beside the dry goods pantry was empty and unlit for nearly an hour after that. She knew these things because knowing them had kept her alive inside a place that was not built for people like her. Her mother, Marit Voss, had served as head palace healer for 19 years. It was an honorable position, the kind that opened doors without granting entry, that offered proximity to power without the warmth of it. Maret had raised Elira in that particular gap, close enough to see the royal family clearly, far enough to understand exactly what she was not. The daughter of a healer. Educated, yes. Trusted with medicines that could stop a bleeding general's heart or coax a fever back from the edge. But not noble. Not chosen. Not the kind of woman that men like Prince Rowan were meant to love. Elira had known that. She had known it for years. It had not stopped her from loving him anyway. That was the particular cruelty of certain feelings. They did not require logic to survive. She had watched Rowan grow from a laughing boy who stole apricots from the kitchen to a man whose smile could quiet a room. And somewhere in that watching, she had grown a feeling so old and quiet, she had almost stopped recognizing it as longing. It had simply become part of her, the way the scar on her left wrist from a broken glass vial was part of her. Present. Unremarkable. Hers. But the lunar selection tournament had made the feeling loud again. She had heard the announcement 3 weeks ago in the east courtyard, pressed against a pillar with a basket of linen bandages on her hip, listening to the palace steward read the proclamation while nobles and servants alike gathered in the weak autumn sun. Prince Rowan of Valderis, second son of the late King Edrin, would select his Luna through formal tournament. She-wolves from every blood-ranked family across the continent were invited to compete. The tournament would run 5 weeks. The chosen mate would be formally presented at the Grand Moon Ball. The words had landed in Elira's chest like cold water. She had stood in that courtyard and felt the last possible version of the future she had quietly imagined for herself. Not a grand future, not an ambitious one, just a small, impossible one where Rowan saw her, really saw her, and chose her not because of blood rank or political advantage, but because she was the one who had always been there. She had felt that future step back from her like a tide going out. So she had made a decision. She was going to tell him the truth before the tournament began, before the candidates arrived, before the machinery of it locked everything in place and made her invisible in the only way that would be permanent. She had spent 3 days composing the speech in her head. She had practiced it in the dark of her small room off the healer's quarters, standing at her wash basin with water going cold in the bowl, speaking to the stone wall until the words stopped shaking. She was not going to beg. She was not going to make it into something humiliating. She was going to say, simply, cleanly, with whatever dignity she had, that she had loved him for a very long time, and that she thought he deserved to know that before he gave himself away to someone who hadn't. What happened after that was up to him. She had promised herself she could live with either answer. That promise was easier to make in the abstract. On the night she finally walked toward his private solar, her hands were damp and her mouth was dry, and the bandage roll she was carrying, the excuse she had given herself for being in that corridor, kept slipping because her grip was too tight. The palace at night had its own particular silence, different from its daytime noise. The torches burned low in their iron brackets. The tapestries along the walls seemed heavier in the dark, the embroidered battle scenes more threatening than decorative. Elira moved through it the way she always moved through spaces she didn't entirely belong in, quickly, quietly, her footsteps adjusted to the rhythm of whatever sound covered them. She knew where Rowan's solar was. She had delivered medicines there twice in the past year, both times handed off to his personal attendant in the anteroom. She knew the corridor. She had mapped it in her mind the way she mapped every corridor she might ever need to navigate without drawing attention. What she had not accounted for was the scaffolding. A section of the western passage was under repair. She hadn't known, hadn't heard about it through the servant channels. And the corridor that should have led her directly to Rowan's anteroom was blocked by wooden scaffolding and canvas sheeting and the smell of fresh plaster. She stood at the barrier for a moment, looking at the detour, recalculating. There was another way. Longer, less direct, threading through the section of the upper palace that connected the royal solar wing to the private council chambers. She had been through it once, years ago, carrying supplies for her mother. The corridor curved. There was a door on the left that she thought led to a reading room, and a door on the right that she was fairly certain opened onto the back of the main stairwell, and then the passage opened out again near the solar wing's outer approach. She took the detour. She walked the curve of the corridor. She reached for the door on the left, and she opened it. The room beyond was not a reading room. It was too large, for one thing. Not vast, but proportioned with the kind of deliberate authority that told you immediately that whoever occupied it had chosen every dimension carefully. The walls were lined with dark wood shelving. There were maps pinned to a standing frame near the window. Not decorative maps, but working ones covered in ink notations and what looked like measurement lines. A fire burned in the hearth, low and steady. A desk sat in the center of the room with documents spread across it, weighed down at the corners by a ceramic ink pot and what appeared to be the hilt of a dagger used as a paperweight. And behind the desk, standing with his back partially turned, reading something by firelight, was King Kalor Draven. Elira's body stopped before her mind did. King Kalor was not a man who announced himself. He didn't need to. He stood the way mountains stood, present without effort, occupying space by right of what he was, rather than any performance of it. He was taller than his brother by half a head, broader through the shoulders in a way that came from actual use rather than ceremony. His dark hair was loose. She had never seen it loose before, always bound back at court, and it made him look less like the king and more like something older and more dangerous than the title implied. He was still reading. He had not heard her. Elira's hand was still on the door handle. She began, very carefully, to pull it closed again. Stop. The word was quiet. That was the most alarming thing about it. Not a shout, not even sharp. Just a single word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and somehow it landed with more authority than any shout could have managed. She stopped. Come in or go out, he said, still not turning. Standing in doorways is a decision you're making regardless. Elira stepped inside, closed the door behind her, stood with her back against it, bandage roll clutched against her chest like a shield, and waited for whatever came next. Kalor turned. She had seen the king many times. She had seen him at court gatherings, at the 3 formal dinners she had attended as a consequence of her mother's position, at the midsummer procession where he rode without armor and somehow looked more dangerous for it. She knew his face. She had thought she knew his face, hard through the jaw, composed through the eyes, carrying the particular flatness of expression that powerful men sometimes develop when they've spent long enough being watched. But she had never been alone in a room with him. Up close, in firelight, his eyes were a shade darker than she remembered. Not quite black. Something between charcoal and amber, depending on where the light struck. They moved over her in a single unhurried assessment. Not the kind of look that felt invasive, but the kind that felt precise, like being measured for something. You're the healer's daughter, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. I apologize. I took a wrong turn around the scaffold repairs. I was looking for... She stopped. I was looking for the back approach to the solar wing. The solar wing, he repeated. There was nothing accusatory in it. There was also nothing that let her off the hook. Yes, at this hour. I had a delivery. She held up the bandage roll slightly. The gesture was small and unconvincing even to her. For the prince's attendant. Kaylor looked at the bandage roll. Then he looked at her. His expression did not change in any way she could name, and yet something in it shifted, some infinitesimal adjustment, like a calculation being updated. The healing corridor makes deliveries before second bell, he said. It's been that way for 11 years. The silence that followed was worse than anything he might have said. Elira felt the heat move up through her chest and into her face, and willed it backward with every piece of self-possession she had ever cultivated. She was not going to let a blush betray her in front of the king. She was not going to do that. I know, she said. I should have followed protocol. I'll go. She reached for the door handle. You came to tell him something. She stilled. Not a delivery, Kaylor said. He moved around the desk, not toward her, just changing his angle, putting himself at the edge of the firelight rather than behind it. You came because the tournament starts in 4 days, and you've been watching him for longer than you want anyone to know, and you decided tonight was the last chance you'd have before everything became official. The room felt very quiet. Elira turned back to face him. Her chin was up. She didn't decide to do that. Her body made the decision independent of her. Some old instinct that she'd learned in years of being underestimated. When you couldn't make yourself larger, you could at least make yourself vertical. That's quite a conclusion, she said. Is it wrong? She didn't answer. His mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that, and considerably more complex. Sit down, he said. There's tea on the stand near the hearth. You look like you've been walking these corridors for the better part of an hour, working up to something. I'm not staying. You're not going to the solar wing either. Rowan left the palace 2 hours ago. He's at the northern garrison for the tournament intake assessments. He won't be back until morning. The words landed with the particular flattening finality. 2 hours ago. He had left 2 hours ago, and she had been in her room practicing a speech to empty stone. Elira stood very still and absorbed this. This is something that happens to people who are not the heroes of their own stories. The world moves without consulting them. They build up to moments. They brace. They prepare. And then the moment isn't there. The room is empty. The person has been gone for 2 hours. And there is nothing to show for all that bracing but the hollow feeling of momentum with nowhere to go. Elira had lived most of her life inside that feeling. She sat down, not because the king had told her to, because her legs had made a separate decision from the rest of her, and for once she was too tired to override them. The chair she chose was the one closest to the door. Not aggressive, not deliberately distant, just positioned the way she positioned herself everywhere, within reach of an exit, a habit so old she no longer noticed she was doing it. Kaylor poured the tea himself. He didn't call for a servant. He simply crossed to the stand, lifted the ceramic pot, poured 2 cups with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to doing things without ceremony, and set one on the edge of the desk nearest her. She picked it up. It was very hot and smelled of pine bark and dried citrus peel, the kind of tea her mother had stocked in the healing stores. She drank it because her hands needed something to do. How long? Kaylor said, returning to his position near the fireplace. Have you been in love with my brother? I don't see how that's relevant to how long. She looked at him. His voice hadn't hardened. It had simply become more direct, which somehow felt worse. 8 years, she said. Approximately. Approximately. I don't keep a precise accounting. 8 years, he repeated, and there was something in the repetition, not judgment, she couldn't locate judgment in it, but something. Like a man rereading a passage in a document because the first reading hadn't quite resolved. And in 8 years you've never told him. I was going to tell him tonight. And now you're telling me. I'm not telling you anything, she said, sharper than she meant. I'm sitting in your council room by accident and you're extrapolating. Correctly. She pressed her mouth together. Kaylor looked at her with that same calibrated attention. Not unkind, not warm, simply observant in a way that felt like being stood in the light. She had a sudden, disorienting awareness of what he must see. A woman in plain working clothes, carrying supplies she didn't actually need, sitting on the edge of a chair in his private chambers with her jaw tight and her eyes too bright from the effort of not being embarrassed. She was in that moment acutely aware that she was not impressive. "You should enter the tournament," he said. The words hit her so strangely that for a moment she wasn't certain she had heard them correctly. "I'm sorry?" "The lunar selection tournament." His voice was completely even. "You should enter." Elira stared at him. "I don't have noble blood," she said. "My mother is the head palace healer. My father was a frontier herbalist who died before I could walk. I don't have a blood rank that qualifies for... The rules require pack lineage, not formal noble title," Kaelor said. He had not moved from his position near the hearth. "Your mother is registered as a Valderis Palace she-wolf. That constitutes pack affiliation. The qualifying threshold is low by design. Rowan wanted a wide field." A pause. "You qualify." Elira looked at him. She had grown up in the palace. She had seen enough political maneuvering to recognize when a thing was being offered and when a thing was being arranged. She could not quite identify which this was. "Why," she said very carefully, "would the king of Valderis care whether a healer's daughter enters his brother's selection tournament?" Kaelor's expression did not change. "Because," he said, "a tournament is only as interesting as the quality of the field." "And you think I'd improve the quality of the field?" "I think most of the candidates arriving in 4 days have spent their entire lives preparing to compete in exactly this kind of event." He picked up his own cup, drank, set it back with the same unhurried precision that characterized every movement she'd seen from him tonight. "Which means they know every expected move, every performance, every way to perform sincerity while calculating advantage." His eyes found hers across the room. "You don't know any of that. That doesn't make me better. That makes me unprepared." "Sometimes those are the same thing." She sat with that for a moment. This was the part of the conversation that felt strange to her in a way she couldn't entirely parse. Not dangerous, not exactly, but unsettling in the way that unexpected honesty from an unexpected source tends to be unsettling. King Kaelor had a reputation. She had grown up hearing it discussed in the servant corridors and the healing rooms, in the hushed, assessing tones that people use for forces they respect more than they like. Hard, precise, demanding in a way that made lesser men fracture under it. He had taken the crown at 23 after his father's death, and had spent 7 years since then holding an empire together through a combination of political intelligence and the particular kind of authority that comes from never needing to remind anyone who you are. She had never heard anyone describe him as kind. She had also never heard anyone describe him as dishonest. "Even if I entered," she said, "I'd lose." "Probably." The directness of it startled a sound out of her. Not quite a laugh, not quite the opposite, something involuntary. "That's not exactly an inspiring case," she said. "I wasn't making an inspiring case." He set his cup down and leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms in a way that looked less like a power pose and more like a man settling into thought. "I'm telling you what's true. You'd probably lose, but you'd lose having tried. And whatever you feel for Rowan, whether it's what you think it is or something else, you'd know you looked it in the eye instead of letting the tournament take the choice away from you." The fire had burned lower while they spoke. The shadows in the room had deepened, and the maps on the standing frame were barely visible now. The ink notations just ghost marks on pale parchment. Elira held her cup and thought about what it meant to be in this room, the wrong room, the unintended room, and being told something true by a man she had never expected to speak to her at all. There was a particular kind of loneliness, she thought, in being known accurately by the wrong person. "What do you get out of it?" she said. "Pardon?" "You suggest I enter the tournament. You tell me I probably lose. You explain my own feelings to me and offer me a true thing I wasn't expecting." She met his eyes. "You're a king, not a counselor. You don't give things away without a reason. What do you get out of it?" The silence that followed was not the absence of thought. She could feel it, something being considered, something being weighed with more precision than she might expect. "An honest competitor in a field full of performances," he said finally. "And that's valuable to you because?" "Because I'll be watching this tournament for 5 weeks." Something shifted in his expressions. Still controlled, but a degree less so. The way a fire looks when the wind finds the one gap in the screen. And I'm tired of watching people perform. Elira held her cup until it went cold. She should have left 20 minutes ago. She should have left the moment the door swung open and revealed the wrong room, the wrong person. She should have apologized and retreated and spent the rest of the night in her small bed, remapping every mistake in the sequence that had led here. Instead, she was sitting in the king's council room at the late hour of the night, listening to him tell her she was tired of performances and feeling for the first time in the 3 days since the tournament announcement something that was not dread. She set the cup down. "I'll think about it," she said. She stood. She did not reach for the door immediately. Some old stubbornness in her refused to flee, even now, even after all of this. She stood straight and looked at him, this man who had unsettled everything in the space of a single hour without raising his voice once. "Elira Voss," she said. Not an introduction. They were past that. More like a reclamation, stating her own name back into a room where it had never been spoken. "I know who you are," Kaylor said. She didn't know why that, of all the things he'd said, was the one that stayed with her as she walked out of the room, back through the dark corridor, past the scaffolding and the smell of fresh plaster, back toward the small part of the palace that belonged to people like her. He knew who she was. She had spent 22 years in this palace, invisible by necessity and design, and the king, not the prince, not the man she had loved for 8 years, the king had looked at her and known exactly who she was. She did not sleep that night. The 4 days before the tournament opened moved through the palace like a tide coming in, fast, unstoppable, and rearranging everything in its path. Candidates began arriving on the second day. Elira watched from the high corridor window above the main approach, half hidden behind the curtain the way she had watched things her entire life, while carriages rolled through the palace gate carrying women who looked like power had been bred into their posture. She-wolves from the northern mountain packs, wearing traveling leathers tooled with clan markings, daughters of the eastern coastal lords, stepping out with the kind of composure that came from being told since childhood that the world was theirs to enter. A pair of sisters from the western border territories who moved in perfect, unsettling synchronization, identical through the jaw, their eyes sweeping the courtyard with the patience of wolves who had been hunting longer than most. Elira stood at her window and felt very small, and then she went downstairs to the registration office and entered her name. She had not in the end thought about it for very long. The truth was simpler than anything she had tried to build around it in 3 days of sleepless calculation. She had been invisible in this palace for 22 years. The tournament would not make her more invisible. It might make her visible in the wrong way. She could almost hear the whispers already. The healer's daughter. What is she thinking? But wrong visibility was still visibility. And she had lived long enough inside the right kind of invisibility to know it was just a quieter way of disappearing. The registrar, an older man named Service who had processed palace paperwork for 30 years and had a face that had learned to express nothing whatsoever, looked at her name on the form for a long moment. "Pack affiliation?" he said. "Valderis Palace Pack," she said. "My mother, Maret Voss, is registered." He checked the ledger. He found it. He made a small notation. "Combat experience?" he said. "Field medicine under emergency conditions," she said. "I've applied pressure to wounds on a battlefield. I don't know if that counts." Service looked at her over the edge of his spectacles. "I'll note it as field operations," he said, with the professionalism of a man who had long since made peace with not judging things. She was given a ribbon, pale blue, for competitors whose wolf form had not yet been formally assessed, and a schedule. First week, physical endurance trials and wolf form evaluation. Second week, combat and strategy assessments. Third week, leadership and social trials. Fourth week, advanced challenges determined by ranking. Fifth week, the final 3. She looked at the schedule and thought about everything she could not do. Then she thought about the one thing she had always been able to do. Not gracefully, not impressively, just stubbornly. She could stay standing after other people sat down. The first trial came on the morning of the 3rd day. The palace arena had been converted for the occasion. Tiered seating built out along the northern wall, banners from every participating pack hung above them in a flutter of territorial declaration. 42 candidates gathered in the lower ring as dawn came over the eastern towers, wearing the practical clothes of women who had been told to prepare for exertion and carrying the expressions of women who had been preparing for this particular kind of exertion their entire lives. Elira stood at the edge of the group in a plain gray training tunic and felt the assessment happening around her without anyone needing to announce it. She was being sized up. She could feel it the same way you could feel a shift in air pressure before weather arrived. The she-wolf from the northern mountain pack, the one with the clan markings on her collar, had already catalogued Elira twice with the particular kind of glance that dismissed without appearing to look. Two of the eastern coastal daughters had exchanged something in a murmur that ended in a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh. Elira put her chin up, looked at the trial markers across the arena floor, studied the layout. She had learned young that preparation was the only advantage she was ever going to have over people who started ahead of her. The trial was declared, a stamina circuit of running, climbing, and load-bearing. 8 full rounds, no assistance, time scored, wolf form optional but assessed. Elira did not shift. Her wolf had always been more functional than impressive. A mid-sized gray with good instincts and no notable markings, the kind of wolf that people looked past rather than at. She made a calculation and stayed human. In human form, she could think through the circuit. She could pace herself in a way that was harder while managing a wolf's impulses. She was not the fastest. She was not the strongest. By the third round, 2 of the noble candidates had already broken clear ahead of the field, running with the particular beautiful ferocity of women who had been trained to do exactly this since they were old enough to run. By the 5th round, Elira's lungs were burning and her legs had moved past pain into a strange, unfeeling heaviness that she recognized from her one experience running supplies across a flooding field during a border skirmish 6 years ago. By the 7th round, she was maintaining pace through pure refusal, not strength, not training, just an unwillingness to stop that had no rational explanation behind it. She finished 8th. Not remarkable. Not what any observer watching for winners would have marked. She stood bent over her knees at the finish line, breathing in ragged pulls, sweat dropping from her forehead onto the packed dirt of the arena floor. And she was still standing when 3 of the women ahead of her had already sat down. She didn't know that she was being watched from the gallery above the arena. She didn't know that the king had stood at the high rail since the 2nd round, arms resting on the railing, observing in the particular silence of a man who had learned long ago that the most important information in any contest was rarely visible in the moments of success. She didn't know any of that. She just straightened up, wiped the sweat from her face with the back of her hand, and walked back to the competitors' line to wait for the scores to be read. That night, she was summoned, not to the solar wing, not to any of the ceremonial rooms she might have expected. The message was delivered by one of the king's personal runners, a young man who handed her a folded note and disappeared before she could ask a single question. And it contained 6 words in handwriting that was precise and unornamented. Training yard. 1 hour. Come alone. She held the note for a long time. Then she went. The training yard was at the back of the palace complex, past the stables and the armory, in a section that the household staff called the Old Yard because it predated the main palace building by 2 generations. It had stone walls worn smooth by decades of weather and no torches. The light was moonlight and the reflected glow from the armory's single window, and it was enough to see by if your eyes adjusted. Kaylor was already there. He was not wearing court clothes. He was in the simple, dark training attire of a man who used the yard regularly and privately, and he was holding a training weapon, a practice blade, not ceremonial, balanced for work rather than show. He set it aside when she arrived. "You finished 8th, he said. "I know." "You didn't shift." "I know." "Why not?" "Because my wolf is faster, but I'm smarter in human form," she said. "In a stamina circuit with 8 rounds, pacing matters more than initial speed. I calculated I'd lose fewer positions through the middle round staying human than I would gain in the first 2 rounds shifting." She paused. "I was right mostly. I could have finished 6th if I'd paced the 4th round better." He looked at her. "That's a more sophisticated assessment than most of the candidates would have made," he said. "I spent 6 hours last night studying the trial format," she said. "Most of them have trained their whole lives. I don't have training, I have preparation." There was that fractional thing in his expression again, the shift she couldn't name but had started watching for. Come back tomorrow night, he said. Why? Because preparation without technique has limits, and because you have 4 weeks left in a tournament that will stop caring about your endurance assessments and start caring about things your preparation alone won't fix. He picked up the practice blade. Can you fight? She thought about the one time she had hit someone with a medicine cabinet. 14 years old, palace kitchen corridor, a noble boy who had taken a disliking to visible commoners, and how that had resolved. Not formally, she said. Then we start there. She should have asked why again. She should have been more careful about the thing that was beginning to happen. The way the king of Valderis was looking at her in this dark yard in the back of the palace, as if she were something specific and already decided upon. She had grown up in a palace. She knew what men who wanted something looked like. But this was not quite that. It was something she didn't have a clean word for, and that was possibly the most dangerous thing about it. She stayed. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that redefined her understanding of the word tired. The mornings were the tournament, trials that escalated by design, growing more brutal and more revealing as the candidate field began to separate. The afternoons were her work in the healing corridors, which she refused to abandon because her mother needed her and because maintaining something ordinary felt important in the middle of everything that was becoming extraordinary. And the nights, late in the backyard, with the moonlight and the armory glow, and the king who never raised his voice and never complimented her unnecessarily and never let her get away with anything less than what she was actually capable of. He was, she had discovered, a devastating teacher. Not cruel. She had braced herself for cruelty. Built a small wall for it in the first session when he corrected her grip on the practice blade with a flatness that felt like dismissal. But it wasn't dismissal, it was accuracy. He corrected what was wrong, noted what was right, and moved forward without either lingering. He didn't perform encouragement. He didn't perform criticism. He simply told her what was true, and the truth was almost always harder and more useful than either. She had started to count on it without meaning to. You're favoring your left side in the defensive stance, he said on the 12th night, watching her move through the third pattern he'd taught her. When you're tired, you pull right slightly before every pivot. Any trained opponent will see it by the second exchange. I know, she said between breaths. My left ankle was broken 2 years ago, and it set slightly stiff. He was quiet for a moment. Then we compensate, he said. Not with sympathy, with problem solving. Lead from a different angle, make the stiffness into a deliberate weight shift rather than a tell. He stepped in to demonstrate. Here, watch. She watched. He moved without waste, without excess. The economy of someone who had spent years making violence into a language that didn't need to shout. She watched and thought about how easy it would have been to stay in love with the wrong person forever. How entirely possible it was to carry a feeling for 8 years and not question whether the feeling was about the person or about something the person represented. Safety, familiarity, the comfortable weight of a dream you'd had so long it had stopped feeling like longing and started feeling like furniture. She was thinking about this when the Royal Guard captain appeared at the yard gate with an expression she didn't like. Your Majesty. The captain's voice was controlled, but not comfortable. The Lady Seraphine has arrived with her family's delegation. She's requested a formal audience and... He paused, and something in the pause was its own message. She's brought the treaty documentation. Killer's posture didn't change, but something in it did. Something that Elira could now, after 12 nights, read more precisely than she had at the beginning. I'll receive her in the morning, he said. She's indicated she'll wait, the captain said. The silence that followed had its own quality. Elira stood at the edge of it, practice blade in hand, sweat cooling on her neck, and watched the king's face do nothing whatsoever while something clearly happened behind it. In the morning, he said again. The captain withdrew. Kaelor turned back to her. Again, he said, nodding at the pattern she'd been running. But Elira's mind had snagged on the captain's words and would not let go. The Lady Seraphine. She knew the name. Everyone in the palace knew the name. Seraphine of House Karath, daughter of the most powerful border lord in the Northern Territories, raised to be exactly what the word alliance implied. Beautiful by all reports. Politically necessary. The kind of woman who arrived with treaty documentation because her relationship to power was transactional by inheritance. There were whispers in the palace corridors. There had been whispers for 2 years. King Kalor was expected to formalize a union with House Karath before the Empire's northern border negotiation reached its next cycle. Lady Seraphine was not here for the tournament. Lady Seraphine was here for the king. Elira ran the pattern. She hit every mark. She did not let anything she was feeling show in her hands or her face, because she had spent 22 years learning that lesson, and she was not going to unlearn it now. But when she walked home from the yard that night, she walked with the particular careful step of someone carrying something fragile that they have not yet decided how to set down. She was at the morning trial, the strategy assessment, which she was quietly better at than the combat had suggested she would be, when she saw them together for the first time. Lady Seraphine was watching from the gallery. She was exactly what the whispers had described, composed, elegantly dressed for observation rather than effort, with the kind of calm that came from never having had to fight for anything in a room. She sat beside an older lord who was clearly her father, and she was looking down at the tournament floor with the expression of someone observing a thing that did not concern her particularly. And beside her, not touching, not intimate, nothing that could be called anything specific, was the king. He was speaking with Seraphine's father. His face was in the court register, that particular arrangement of features that meant nothing was happening except politics, and politics was always happening. He was not looking at the tournament floor. He was not looking at Elira. He was not looking at her, and she was not. She told herself this firmly, watching the strategy assessment's next round begin, picking up a game piece and placing it with fingers that were steadier than she had any right to expect. She was not whatever she had started to feel in the wrong room on the wrong night. Through 12 late evenings in a backyard with a man who had told her to enter a tournament, she was probably going to lose. She was not that. She placed the game piece. She looked up once at the gallery. Kalor was still speaking with Seraphine's father, but his eyes, for one moment, one single moment in the whole of the strategy assessment, were not on the diplomat. They were on her. She dropped her gaze. The round continued. She told herself she had imagined it. But that night, for the first time in 2 weeks, there was no note from the king's runner. No summons for the training yard. No 6 words in precise, unornamented handwriting. Elira sat in her small room and listened to the palace breathe around her, and felt the silence of the night settle into her the way cold settles into stone. Slowly, completely, without asking permission. She had been foolish, she thought. She had been precisely the kind of foolish she had always been careful not to be. She had felt something she hadn't examined before she let it take up space. She picked up the tournament schedule from her desk. 14 days remaining. She had somehow survived the first 2 weeks. She was ranked 11th out of 28 remaining candidates, not high enough to threaten anyone, not low enough to have been dismissed yet. She looked at the schedule. She looked at her ankle, wrapped tight with the same technique her mother had taught her, and the same technique she had been refining for 2 years. She put the schedule down and went to sleep. What she did not see, because she was in her small room and the palace was large and full of corridors, she had not walked tonight. The king standing at the window of his council room, the same room she had entered by accident on that first night, with his hands behind his back and his face turned toward the moonlit city below the palace walls. What she did not see. The document on his desk behind him, bearing House Karath's seal and the formal structure of a proposed union agreement, sitting unread where it had been placed that morning. What she did not see. The look on Kylor's face when he finally turned from the window. She didn't see any of it. But in this story, the way all true things eventually become clear, it will matter very shortly. Because on the morning of the 15th day, Elira woke early and went to the training yard alone, running the patterns the king had taught her by the gray light before the palace was fully awake. And she was on the 3rd sequence, moving through the weight shift correction for her ankle, when she heard voices from behind the armory wall. 2 voices. One was a woman's, clipped, confident, carrying the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. The other was the king's. She was not trying to listen. She had stopped moving to adjust her grip on the practice blade, and in the stillness between one movement and the next, the voices had found her. "Understand what this treaty represents," the woman's voice said. "My father has held those northern passes for 20 years. What he's offering you is not just alliance, it's security you cannot purchase through any other negotiation currently available to you. I'm aware of what it represents, Kaylor said. Then why is there no answer? The document has been sitting on your desk since yesterday morning. A pause. Because I haven't decided to sign it. Another pause, longer, with a different texture. The lunar tournament is a lovely spectacle, the woman said. The word lovely landed like a dismissal of everything it touched. But it doesn't address your northern border. It doesn't address the Karath passes. And it doesn't address— the voice shifted, became more precise. Whatever distraction seems to have your attention this past 2 weeks. Silence. Seraphine, Kaylor said, and his voice was very quiet and very final. We will discuss the document at the formal meeting tomorrow. Not here. Elira heard footsteps. She heard a door. She stood in the training yard with the practice blade at her side and the gray morning light coming up over the armory wall. And something that had been taking shape in her chest for 2 weeks cracked along a line she hadn't known was there. Not shattered, not gone. Just cracked. Because she understood now what she had not let herself understand. She had felt something real. She had let herself feel it. And the man at the center of it was standing behind an armory wall discussing a political marriage with a woman who had arrived with treaty documentation, and Elira was standing in a training yard she'd been invited to by someone who had no business inviting her anywhere at all. She set the practice blade down against the wall. She walked back toward the healing corridor. She was halfway there when the runner caught up with her. Young, out of breath, holding a note. She looked at it for a long moment before she took it. She opened it. One word. Tonight. She stood in the corridor with morning coming up around her, and the palace waking into its ceaseless motion, and the tournament schedule ticking forward toward its inevitable conclusion, and she held the note in her hand, and she made a decision she hadn't quite made yet. She was going to go. Not because she trusted it, not because the crack in her chest had already healed, but because she had walked through the wrong door once and found something she hadn't expected, and she was not yet ready, not quite yet, to decide what it meant or didn't mean, or who she was becoming in the space of it. She folded the note. She put it in her pocket. She walked into the healing corridor, where her mother was already at work, and she put her hands to use in the only way she had always known how. Steady, careful, doing what was needed without asking who would notice. But that evening, just before the last light left the sky, a palace messenger arrived at the healing ward with an official document bearing the royal seal. And when Elira's mother took it and read it and went very still, Elira felt the specific cold of something gone wrong before anyone said a single word. "What is it?" she said. Her mother looked up. The expression on Mare Voss's face was something Elira had never seen there before, something careful and complicated and carrying the weight of information that had arrived too late to protect anyone from. "It's an announcement," her mother said very quietly, "from the Palace Council." "What announcement?" Marit set the document on the work table slowly, the way you set down a thing that is heavier than it looks. "King Kaylor," she said, "will be formally receiving Lady Seraphine of House Karath at the Grand Moon Ball as the Empire's proposed queen." The healing ward was very still. Elira heard the palace breathing around her, steady, restless, indifferent to the people inside it. She looked at the document. She looked at her mother's face. She thought about 6 words in unornamented handwriting. She thought about 12 nights in a backyard, and a cup of tea that went cold, and a man who had said, "I know who you are," like it was a simple truth when it was, apparently, the most complicated one in the palace. Tonight. He had written tonight, and tonight, she now understood, meant something entirely different than she had allowed herself to imagine. She reached for her apron, untied it, set it on the table next to the announcement document. "I'm going out," she said. Her mother said her name, once, with everything that had always been unsaid between them about this place and this life, and the particular danger of wanting things that weren't built for you. Elira didn't stop. She walked out of the healing ward into the corridor toward the back of the palace where the training yard sat in the late moonlight. She walked with her head up and her hands steady, and her ankle aching in the way it always ached at the end of a long day. And she did not know yet whether she was walking toward something she would regret or away from something she needed to understand. She did not know, but she was walking. And behind her, pinned to the wall of the empty training yard by the weight of its own seal, was a second document that no one in the healing ward had yet seen. Not the official announcement, not the one her mother had received, a different one, bearing a different seal. The seal of the king's private office, pressed in dark wax, delivered to the training yard at the instruction of no one the guard captain could later clearly recall. Inside it, in the same precise handwriting that Elira would have recognized anywhere, a single sentence. Not an invitation, not a summons, a confession. She would find it when she arrived, and what was written inside would undo every assumption she had walked in carrying, and leave her standing in the moonlit yard with a choice that no tournament, no treaty, and no carefully constructed invisibility could make for her. The training yard was empty when Elira arrived. Not dark, the moon was up, and the armory's single window threw its usual pale rectangle across the packed dirt, but empty in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. No guard at the gate, no sound from the stable block, just the yard and the stone walls and the nighttime smell of old leather and cold iron. And pinned to the gatepost at eye level, a document bearing a seal she recognized before she was close enough to read what was inside it. She unpinned it. She read it. She stood very still for a long time after. What Kaylor had written was not long. He was not a man who used words for decoration, and the note reflected that in the same way all his communication did, stripped to the structure, nothing added for comfort or softening. But even stripped of everything unnecessary, what remained was enough. He had written, "I was going to sign it." 3 weeks ago, when Seraphine's delegation first made contact, I had every intention of signing it. The northern passes matter. The treaty terms are reasonable. The match is politically sound. I have known this and intended to act on it since before the tournament was announced. I am telling you this because I believe you deserve to know the exact thing I was going to do, and because I am no longer certain I can do it. That uncertainty is new. I do not know yet what to make of it. Tonight I will be in the yard. What happens after that is a decision I cannot make without you present. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the same pocket as the first note and sat down on the stone bench along the far wall and waited. She did not wait long. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. She had learned in 2 weeks of late evenings to recognize the particular cadence of the way he moved. Not heavy, not slow, but deliberate. Every step placed with intention. The walk of a man who had learned that how you entered a room mattered as much as what you did once inside it. He came through the gate and stopped. She was already looking at him. He was in court clothes this time, not training attire. Dark wool, no ceremonial additions, but cut and worn in a way that made the formality impossible to ignore. He had come from something, or he had come to this as something. She wasn't sure which. "You read it," he said. "Yes." "And you came anyway." "I came because I needed to understand something," she said. He walked in, stopped a few feet from the bench, did not sit. Kaylor never sat when he was in the middle of something unresolved. She had noticed that. He stood the way he always stood, with his hands loose at his sides and his posture doing nothing theatrical, and he looked at her with that direct, measuring quality that had stopped being intimidating somewhere around the 5th or 6th session and had started being something she didn't have a precise word for. "What do you need to understand?" he said. "The note says you were going to sign it." She kept her voice level. "It also says you're no longer certain you can. I need to know if those two things are connected to me or if they're connected to the treaty terms, because those are not the same thing and I will not allow myself to confuse them." Something moved in his expression. "They're connected to you," he said. The words landed simply, the way he always said true things, without architecture around them, without anything to blunt the impact or make them easier to receive. Elira held them. "You've known me for 2 weeks," she said. "I've known who you are for considerably longer than 2 weeks, he said. "I've known you since you were 17 and you sat in the back of your mother's certification hearing and corrected the palace physician's dosage notation without being asked and then went immediately quiet again as if you hadn't done it." She stared at him. "You were at that hearing?" "I was at that hearing," he confirmed. "My father had died 11 months before. I was going through the certification processes for every palace department as part of the transfer. You were the only person in the room who looked at the actual numbers." She did not know what to do with this. She filed it somewhere behind the more immediate pressure of the conversation. "That was 5 years ago," she said. "Yes." "And in 5 years you've never said anything?" The line of his mouth tightened fractionally. "No." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the kind of quiet that was buying time, the kind that was being precise. "Because I had a kingdom to stabilize," he said, "and you were a healer's daughter without blood rank in a court that would have destroyed you if I'd given them reason to look at you more closely. Because any interest from me would have been experienced by you as an imposition you had no safe way to decline. Because I made the decision that the correct thing, the right thing, was to stay removed." He paused. "I have spent 5 years being correct about that. And now? And now you entered a tournament you're probably going to lose, and you come to this yard every night and run patterns you learned in 2 weeks against opponents who have trained for 2 decades. And you do it without complaint and without performance. And—" He stopped, looked at her with something that was not restrained so much as it was simply unguarded in a way she hadn't seen on him before. "And I am finding it increasingly difficult to remain correct about things. This is what power does to a person, over time. It doesn't make them less human. It makes them more precise about which parts of their humanity they can afford to express, and more acutely aware of the cost of each one." Kaelor had spent 7 years as king making correct decisions. He had built the empire's stability on the accumulated weight of choosing what was right over what he wanted, so consistently and for so long that the 2 categories had begun to feel like the same thing. The discovery that they were not, that somewhere beneath the architecture of his correctness, there was a thing that was his and not the empire's, and not duty's and not anyone else's, was not for a man like him a welcome discovery. It was an earthquake in a building you'd spent years making earthquake-proof. "I need you to tell me something honestly," Elira said. "All right?" "The tournament." She watched his face. "Was any part of suggesting I enter it about this?" The pause was brief but real. "Yes," he said. She felt the answer move through her. Not shock. She had already suspected. But suspicion and confirmation were different things, and the difference landed. "Then you put me in that field knowing what I was walking into," she said. Her voice had an edge in it now. Not rage, but the particular sharpness of someone who needs the person in front of them to understand the weight of what they've done. "You knew I was there because of Rowan. You knew I was already vulnerable, and you handed me away to stay in the palace, in the tournament, close to you, without ever naming it as what it was." "Yes," he said again. No deflection, no justification. That was calculated. "Yes." "And you don't think that was wrong?" He looked at her for a moment. "I think it was the first thing I've done in 5 years that was entirely mine," he said. "I'm not certain that makes it right, but I'm not willing to call it wrong when the alternative was standing aside while you walked out of my council room and stayed invisible for the rest of your life, because no one ever gave you a reason not to." The yard was very quiet. Elira stood up from the bench. Not because she was leaving, she didn't know if she was leaving, but because sitting while processing this felt like the wrong geometry for it. She needed to be upright. She needed her feet on the ground. "The announcement," she said, "the one my mother received this afternoon, was that real?" "Which part of it?" "The part where you formally received Lady Seraphine at the Grand Moon Ball as the Empire's proposed queen." Kaelor was quiet for 3 full seconds. "That announcement was drafted and sent by the council without my explicit authorization," he said. "Lord Savan, my head council minister, has been managing the Karath negotiation since the first contact. He had standing authority to manage diplomatic correspondence. He interpreted that authority more broadly than I intended." "Did he draft it, or did he release something you had already approved?" The question was precise. She had learned in 2 weeks to watch for the difference between an answer and a deflection in this particular man. "He released a version of correspondence I had reviewed 3 weeks ago," Kaelor said, "before the tournament began and before—" He paused. "Before my position on the matter became less settled." "So it was real," she said. "It was real when you wrote it, even if it's less real now." "Yes." She walked 3 steps in no particular direction, then stopped. The packed dirt of the training yard was smooth under her boots. She had run this ground dozens of times in the past 2 weeks. It felt strange to be standing still in it. "What do you want from me?" she said. Not unkindly, not with the heat of accusation, just cleanly. The question she needed answered. Kaelor was quiet. And in the quiet, she watched him do something she had not seen him do once in 2 weeks of late evenings. She watched him struggle. Not visibly. Not in any way that would have been legible to someone who hadn't spent hours learning to read the minimal register of this man's face. But it was there, the jaw setting and releasing, the breath that came slightly slower than his normal rhythm. "I want to stop pretending the Kareth Treaty is the most important thing in this palace," he said. "And I want—" He stopped, started again. "I want you to know what you're worth to someone who has watched you long enough to see it clearly, because I don't believe you do. And I want to stop being correct at the expense of what I actually—" He stopped. "What you actually want," she finished. "Yes." The word fell into the night air and stayed there between them. Alira looked at him. This man who had ruled an empire for 7 years through pure precision, who had managed her in this yard for 2 weeks like a problem he was solving, who had handed her the announcement of a political marriage with another woman's name on it, and then written her a confession in the same handwriting. And she felt the full complicated weight of what it meant to be seen by exactly the wrong person at exactly the right time. She had loved Rowan for 8 years. She had carried that feeling like furniture, like something fixed, and she had almost let a tournament take the last of it from her without ever looking at it clearly. She had walked through the wrong door and found something that had spent 3 weeks systematically dismantling the feeling she'd been most certain of, replacing it not with something easier, but with something truer and considerably more frightening. "If I stay in this tournament," she said slowly, "and I continue to come to this yard, and I let this continue, whatever this is, you need to understand that I am not a thing you can pick up and set aside based on what the council decides is politically necessary. I will not be managed." "I know," he said. "Do you?" "I'm not attempting to manage you," he said. "I'm telling you the truth. That is the opposite of managing you. Telling me the truth while the Kareth Treaty is still unsigned on your desk is not entirely the opposite of managing me," she said. "It is a version of having both options available until you decide which one to exercise." He looked at her. "That," he said very quietly, "is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in years." The admission moved through the yard like a drop of cold water. She looked at him. He looked at her. The moon was fully up now, flooding the yard with the kind of light that stripped color from everything and left only outline. And in it, Kaelor Draven looked less like a king and more like a man who had been running a very long performance for a very long time and had arrived unexpectedly at the moment where someone in the audience was watching closely enough to see the seams. "I'm going back to the healing ward," she said. He didn't protest. "Tomorrow's trial is the combat assessment," she said. "The second round bracket. I've studied the format." She looked at him. "I know what I'm going into." "You're ranked 11th, he said. "The combat bracket will be drawn to separate the top 5. You'll face a midfield opponent." "I know." She started toward the gate, stopped, turned back, because there was one more thing, and she was not leaving it unsaid. The note said, "You don't know yet what to make of your uncertainty." "Yes. Figure it out," she said, "before the ball. Because I will not walk out of a tournament and directly into an ambiguity. I've been invisible my whole life. If I'm going to be visible, I'm going to be visible clearly." She walked through the gate. She walked back through the palace without hurrying, without running, with her head straight and her ankle aching and the 2 notes folded in her pocket. And she did not let herself replay the conversation until she was in her own room with the door shut behind her. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed. She was in love with the king. She hadn't decided to be. She wasn't sure when it had become true rather than just possible. But it was true. She could feel the shape of it the way you could feel the shape of a healed wrong bone, the ache that told you something had been set in a new position and was never going back to the old one. She was in love with the king, and he had told her she was worth something, and there was a treaty unsigned on his desk with another woman's name at the bottom, and she had 8 more days of tournament before the grand moon ball decided everything. She lay down. She stared at the ceiling. She slept 4 hours. The combat assessment was brutal in the way that revealed its design. It was not testing whether you could win. It was testing what you did when you were losing, how you moved when your body had already decided to fail, how you calculated when the calculation was happening too fast for anything but instinct. Alira understood this clearly by the end of her first round, which she won against a she-wolf from the coastal lowlands who was faster but less patient, and by the beginning of her second, which she lost, decisively and early, against a Northern Mountain candidate named Vera, who fought with the kind of violence that had been cultivated rather than discovered. She lost it in 40 seconds. She stood up. She reset. She inclined her head in the formal acknowledgement of the result and walked off the combat floor with her jaw aching from where she'd taken a hit and her shoulders singing from the fall and something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it sitting in her chest. She had gotten a hit in. One, in 40 seconds, against a woman who had been trained since childhood. One hit. It was not nothing. She was sitting at the edge of the assessment area, pressing the back of her wrist against her split lip when Rowan appeared beside her. She had not spoken to the prince in 2 weeks. He had been present at the tournament in the formal capacity, seated in the gallery, receiving candidates at the arranged evening presentations, but their paths had not crossed in any way that required direct interaction. He was the sun this tournament revolved around, and she had been in the outer orbit, far enough from the center to be technically present without being seen. He sat down beside her without asking. "That was Vera Kane," he said. He had his court face on, the easy, charming surface, but his voice carried something under it. "She's beaten everyone she's faced. You lasted 40 seconds. 38, she said. I counted. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not a loss of composure, more an adjustment, like a man realizing the conversation he thought he was walking into is not the conversation that's actually happening. "Why did you enter?" he said. She looked at him. 8 years. She had loved this man for 8 years, or believed she had, or made a practice of it so long that the practice had become indistinguishable from the real thing. She looked at his face now, at the familiar angles of it, and waited for the feeling she had always associated with his presence to rise the way it was supposed to. It didn't. Not because it was gone entirely, but because it was small now, and what it was small against was something she hadn't had 2 weeks ago. A sense of what it felt like to be looked at by someone who actually saw you, and to discover that what you'd mistaken for love was the comfortable weight of being near someone who had never quite looked at you at all. "I entered because I needed to know if what I felt was real or just old," she said. Rowan absorbed this slowly. "And?" he said. "Old," she said, simply, without cruelty, without apology. "It was old." He was quiet for a long time. "I should have looked at you differently," he said finally. "You're kind," she said. "You were always kind. That's not the same thing. It's a peculiar mercy sometimes to find that the thing you thought you wanted was not what you needed. Not because it was bad, but because it was shaped for a different version of you, the one you were before something changed the outline." Rowan was not the villain of this story. He was a prince who had never looked closely enough at what was standing right beside him, which is the particular failure of men who have always had enough options not to need to look carefully at any one of them. He was not cruel. He was not wicked. He was simply the wrong person, named correctly far too late. "Kaler has been in the yard with you," Rowan said. Not a question. She stilled. "I know it isn't—" Rowan stopped, resettled. "He doesn't do things like that. He's never done anything like that." "I know," she said. "That should tell you something." "It does," she said. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he looked away. At the combat floor where the next pair of candidates was preparing, at the banners above the arena carrying the crests of a dozen packs. And something in his expression settled into something she recognized as the particular look of a man making peace with a thing he cannot change. "The ball is in 8 days," he said. "I know. If you're still in the tournament by then." "I'll be in the tournament," she said. He nodded once. He stood. He looked down at her for a moment, not with desire, not with possession, but with something more honest than either. "He's better than he looks like from the outside," Rowan said. "I know that too," she said. He walked away. She watched him go and felt the 8 years settle into their correct place. Not erased, not dishonored, just properly filed. Done. Real, in the way that everything you carry for a long time is real and finished, in the way that real things can be finished without becoming false. She turned back to the combat floor. She had 6 more rounds of assessment today. She was going to lose most of them. She stood up and walked back to the line. The week that followed was the worst one yet. The trials shifted into their 3rd phase, and the 3rd phase was the one designed to crack whatever the first 2 had not. leadership assessments, social trials, the kind of evaluation that required not physical strength or tactical thought, but the ability to hold authority in front of a room full of people who were actively looking for the moment you would crack under the weight of it. These were the trials that the noble candidates had been raised for. They moved through social and leadership assessments the way Elira moved through healing corridors, by instinct, by practice, by the accumulated memory of 1,000 smaller versions of the same thing. Elira had none of that. She had something else. She had spent 22 years watching how power actually worked inside a palace. Not the performed version of it, but the real mechanics. She had watched healers manage dying generals. She had watched her mother speak truth to men twice her rank because she had to, and because she had learned to do it in a way that gave them room to hear it. She had watched the gap between what powerful people performed and what they actually needed, and she had learned, in her own small and invisible way, to work in that gap. The leadership trial put 14 remaining candidates in a scenario, a simulated border dispute between two fictional pacts, resources limited, decision timeline compressed. They were given information, they were given authority, they were given 10 minutes and an audience. Most of the candidates led with assertion. They moved fast, named decisions clearly, displayed the visible markers of leadership that had been practiced into them. Several of them were genuinely good. Vera Kane, who had beaten Elira in 40 seconds, had the strategic clarity of someone who had been making real decisions in real conditions her entire life. Elira did something different. She listened for 4 of her 10 minutes. Not performing listening, actually doing it, processing the information in the scenario for longer than felt comfortable, long enough that the assessors watching from the gallery above must have wondered if she had frozen. Then she named exactly 2 decisions, the one that was not negotiable and why, and the one that had room for flexibility and how. She assigned roles based on what she had actually observed about the other candidates' strengths over the past 2 weeks, not based on rank, not based on display. She finished with 2 minutes to spare. She ranked 3rd in the leadership trial. She found out in the corridor after, from Service the registrar, who told her with the same professional neutrality with which he had entered her name in the first place. She stood in the corridor and absorbed being ranked 3rd in something, which was new. That night, the runner came again. She went to the yard. Kaler was there before her, and he had a bottle of something that turned out to be a northern grain spirit, which he poured into 2 plain cups without ceremony and handed one to her without asking if she wanted it. She took it. 3rd, he said. 3rd, she confirmed. I watched. I know. She sat on the bench. Was it... She stopped, started differently. The listening part. Was it too long? For the candidates who were performing leadership, yes, he said. For a room of assessors who have seen the same performance 100 times, no. She drank. The spirit was sharp and very warm going down, and it hit the hollow between her ribs and stayed there. What's your total ranking? She said. 7th, he said. She looked at him. You've been tracking my position. I've been tracking the field, he said, which includes your position. Kylor. Something happened when she said his name. Not the title, not the form of address. His name. She hadn't done it before. She watched it land on him, watched the specific, controlled stillness of his response, which was the closest she had seen him come to not being in control of his response. What did you decide? She said. About what you're uncertain about. I haven't signed the treaty, he said. That's not what I asked. He set his cup down. I decided, he said very carefully, that I have been the king of Valderis for 7 years, and I have not wanted a single thing for myself in those 7 years that wasn't also strategically justified. He looked at her. I want you. I cannot make that strategically justified. I've tried. I've gone back over every argument and every calculation and every political consequence, and I cannot make it clean. It is simply what it is. She held the cup in both hands. The yard was quiet. The moonlight was the same as it always was. Then it's real, she said. Yes. And the treaty? I'm going to dissolve the engagement negotiation, he said, formally, through the council, on record, in the morning. Elira was quiet for a very long time. Then she set her cup down beside his on the bench and stood up and walked the 3 steps between them and looked up at him. Because he was taller and she was not going to pretend otherwise. And she said, quietly, because the yard was quiet, and because this did not need to be loud, "If you do that, you do it for the right reason, not because of me, because it is what you actually want." "Those are the same thing," he said. "They need to stay the same thing," she said. "Even after I lose this tournament and go back to the healing ward, and you have to explain to the council why you dissolved a politically sound treaty negotiation, they need to still be the same thing then." "They will be," he said. She looked at him. She had walked through the wrong door 2 weeks ago and found a man who had been watching her for 5 years and said nothing because he thought the correct thing and the right thing were the same, and had spent 2 weeks learning they were not. She had come to this yard night after night and been taught things that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with what she was actually capable of when someone held her accountable to it. She had fallen out of love with the wrong person and into something entirely more frightening with a man who ran an empire and had no practice with wanting anything that wasn't strategically justified. She reached up. She put her hand flat against his chest, not the gesture of a woman reaching for a man who had asked for it, but the gesture of a woman making contact with something real, checking its weight, making sure it was actually there. He went very still. She could feel his heartbeat. It was faster than his exterior suggested. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes," he said. She took her hand back, picked up her cup, finished the spirit. "I'll see you at the trial," she said. She walked out of this yard. She was 3 steps into the corridor beyond the gate when she heard it. Voices from inside the palace, sharp and close, coming from the small council anteroom whose window opened above the training yard's outer wall. 2 voices she recognized, Lord Saivan, the head council minister, and a woman's voice that was not Seraphine but carried the same North Border cadence. "Cannot allow him to dissolve the negotiation on the basis of a passing interest," Seven said. "The Karath passes are not a peripheral matter. If House Karath withdraws their support, he's the king," the other voice said, not agreeing, clarifying. "He makes that decision. He makes it in consultation with this council," Seven said, "which means he makes it after we've had adequate time to make clear what's at stake. And what's at stake is not just northern access. It's the question of what precedent this sets. A king who dissolves a treaty negotiation because a tournament entrant has caught his eye is a king who has lost the discipline the empire requires." A pause. "What's being proposed?" the other voice said. Savan's voice dropped. She had to strain to hear it. "The tournament standings," he said. "There are ways to influence them. If the candidate in question fails to advance past the current round, the problem resolves itself naturally. He'll have no basis to—" Elira stopped listening. She stood in the corridor with the cold stone at her back and the 2 notes still folded in her pocket and the warmth of the grain spirit sitting in her chest. And she understood with the particular clarity of someone who has just heard the precise shape of the threat coming toward them that the tournament was no longer just a tournament. Someone on the council knew. And someone on the council intended to end this before it could become something the king had acted on permanently. She stood there for 3 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back toward the training yard gate. Because there was something she needed to tell Kaylor, and she was not going to wait until morning to tell it. And because she had learned, in 2 weeks of being taught by a man who never flinched from true things, that the moment you wait to name a threat is the moment the threat gains exactly the ground it needs to win. She pushed the gate open. He was still there. He looked at her. "There's a problem," she said. And behind her, in the palace above the yard, Lord Saivan was still speaking. To someone, about something, in the low and careful tones of a man who had decided the king's uncertainty was a political liability that could not be allowed to reach morning. Kaylor listened without interrupting. That was the first thing she noticed. He did not ask her to slow down or repeat herself. He stood in the training yard with his arms at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when he was processing information that required action, and he listened to every word she had overheard through the council anteroom window with the complete still attention of a man who had learned that the most dangerous moment in any conflict was the one where urgency overrode accuracy. She told him exactly what she had heard. She did not editorialize. She had worked in a healing ward long enough to know that the most useful account of anything was the one that stayed as close as possible to what had actually happened. When she finished, the yard was quiet. "Sevan?" he said. "Yes." "You're certain it was his voice?" I've heard him speak in the corridor outside the healing ward for 11 years, she said. Yes. He was quiet for 10 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Go back to your room, he said. I need you out of this yard before the second bell, he said. The flatness of it was not dismissal. It was protection packaged as instruction. If Sayavan has already identified you as the variable he needs to remove, being in this yard past the second bell gives him grounds to frame this as exactly what he wants it to look like. A king distracted by a woman beneath his rank, she said. Yes. She held his gaze. He held hers. There was nothing theatrical in it, just two people in a dark yard making a calculation about what was survivable. I'll send word, he said. Don't come to the yard tomorrow night until you hear from me. She left. She walked back through the palace and did not look at the council anteroom window as she passed beneath it. And she went to her room and she lay down and she did not sleep at all. Morning came gray and cold and without word from the king's runner. The fourth phase trials ran in the palace's formal reception hall. The social assessment round, diplomatic scenario, full gallery present. Elira dressed carefully, not elaborately. She didn't have elaborate to draw from, but with the precision of someone who understood that how you entered a room that had already decided what it thought of you was its own separate preparation. Plain clothes, well-fitted, her hair controlled, the bandage on her ankle tight. She saw Sayavan before she saw anyone else. Third row, gallery left, formal council robes speaking quietly with a man in North Border colors she didn't recognize. Sayavan's eyes found her across the room as she moved to her position. He did not look away. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to register, short enough to communicate nothing useful to him, and then looked at the trial format board on the far wall. She was here to compete. The competing had not stopped because the politics had become complicated. When her name was called for the mediation scenario, she walked to the center of the room and stood in the space between the two fictional parties and felt the gallery's weight settle on her, the way it always settled on people who were not supposed to be exactly where they were standing. 22 years of making herself invisible had, paradoxically, prepared her for this. She knew exactly what a room felt like when it had already decided against you, and she knew how to stand inside that feeling without letting it reach her posture. She handled the mediation in 9 minutes. She gave each party what they could reasonably expect and named clearly what they could not have. And when the fictional party pushed back as scripted, she looked at them with the same expression she used in the ward when a patient refused treatment and said, simply, "That's your choice, but you'll make it knowing the full consequence." She walked back to her position when it was done. Savan began to clap, slowly, precisely. The performance of applause from a man who had already decided the outcome and could afford to appear gracious about it. She did not look at him. By afternoon, the standings posted her at 5th. She was still at the board when her mother appeared beside her. Maret Voss said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the board the way she looked at complicated wounds, assessing, not reacting. There were 2 men outside the healing ward this morning, Maret said finally. They waited 2 hours and left when the trial schedules were announced. Council runners, Sayavans. Elira went still. They were watching the ward, she said. They were watching you, her mother said. There's a difference. Elira stood with the number 5 beside her name, and the full shape of what was building around her assembled clearly in her mind for the first time. Not just a council minister with a treaty preference, a coordinated effort, runners at the healing ward, eyes on the training yard, Sayavan in the gallery applauding like a man who had already won something she hadn't yet understood she was losing. No word came from Kaelor before dinner. No word came from Kaelor before the second bell. She woke at the third bell to Boots in the corridor outside her door, present in a way that Boots were not usually present at 3 in the morning outside a healer's ward assistant's room. She lay still. She heard them pass. She heard them stop. She heard them continue. She got up and opened her door. The corridor was empty. On the floor directly outside, placed with the careful precision of something deliberately positioned rather than dropped, was a folded document. No seal. No handwriting she recognized. Inside, formal block letters. A citation. Tournament Rules, Section 12. Conduct incompatible with the dignity of the selection process. Preliminary determination of disqualification. Formal hearing scheduled for the morning of the 7th day. She read it 3 times. Her hands were steady. Savan hadn't bothered with the standings. He had gone straight to the mechanism that would remove her from the tournament entirely, before the final round, before the ball, before anything became permanent. A conduct citation was reviewable, yes, but the preliminary determination was sufficient to pull her from tomorrow's trial and eliminate the final round standings that determined who stood before the court at the Grand Moon Ball. Clean, efficient, deniable. At first light, she went to the palace library. 40 minutes in the rules archive. Section 12, in its complete form, 4 paragraphs. The first 3 covering conduct at official events, and the 4th, the one cited, covering private conduct incompatible with the dignity of the selection process. Then the review procedures. A complaint required a named party with standing to file, a specific allegation, supporting evidence, a panel of 3 assessors. A named party. She went to find service. The registrar was in his office early, as always. She put the citation on his desk. He read it without changing his expression. "Who filed this?" she said. "Preliminary determinations are issued by the Oversight Committee." "Based on a complaint from a named party," she said, "Section 15 requires the filing be provided to the cited candidate. It wasn't." She looked at him steadily. "That's a process violation." He looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and retrieved the underlying complaint. Lord Aldrich. Not Savan directly. Aldrich, whose corridor smelled of old pine and beeswax, whose name she knew from 19 years of palace geography as a man nobody denied. The complaint cited observation of private meetings between a tournament candidate and the king conducted without oversight, constituting conduct incompatible with the selection process's integrity. The training yard. Someone had been watching the training yard for weeks. She handed the filing back to service. "The hearing is tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes." "I'll be there." She walked out. This is what sustained institutional power actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic force, not obvious cruelty, but the patient, invisible work of people who understand that the most effective control is the kind that appears to be procedure. Savan had not invented the citation or the rules or the oversight committee. He had simply learned over years of working inside a system which levers moved, which outcomes when pulled, in which order. The genius of it was that it required Elira to fight the process rather than the person. And fighting a process is exhausting and designed to be, because a process has no face and no conscience and no moment of doubt that you can appeal to. She understood all of this. She also understood, standing in the corridor outside Service's office, that understanding a trap clearly did not automatically produce the exit. She needed to reach Kaelor. She turned toward the king's chamber's wing. She was stopped at the corridor junction by 2 guards, not the regular rotation, different ones, posted in a configuration that blocked the direct route. She looked at them. They looked at her. "The king is in session with the full council," one said. "He's asked not to be disturbed." Savan had called an emergency meeting. She understood the timing immediately. Pull the king into a room he couldn't leave without appearing to abandon his political obligations. File the citation overnight. Let the machinery run while the man most capable of stopping it was procedurally occupied. "Tell him Elira Voss needs to speak with him before the morning trial," she said. "I'll pass the message," the guard said. She walked away. The 5th phase trial, wolf form assessment, endurance and agility on the palace outer grounds, came and went without word from Kaelor. Her gray wolf ran the course steady and unspectacular. She finished 14th. When the standings went up that afternoon, she was 9th. She had dropped 4 positions in a single trial. The top 5 for the Grand Moon Ball had effectively set, and she was not in them, and the conduct hearing in the morning was going to make her ranking irrelevant regardless. She was looking at the board when she heard Kaelor's step behind her. She turned. He was in court clothes coming from the session, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical. The tiredness of a man who had spent a full day in a room where every person wanted something from him, and none of them shared his actual interest. "I know about the citation," he said quietly, "and I know about the hearing." "He pulled you into a room," she said. "Full council. Emergency session. Karath delegation present as guests." He paused. "Professionally executed. What happened in the session? I dissolved the Karath negotiation. She stared at him. Formally, he said. On the record, with Seraphine's father in the room. Treaty terms no longer aligned with strategic priorities, redirecting to a different diplomatic track. She understood what that had cost. Not in his face. His face was controlled, as always, but in the fact of it. He had handed Saevin and Aldrich and every political interest in this palace a true story, and a true story was always more dangerous than a fabricated one because you couldn't deny what had actually happened. They're going to come harder now, she said. Yes. Kaelor, the hearing tomorrow, I'm going to appear at the hearing, he said. You can't. If you appear to defend a candidate you're involved with, you make the story real. You give them exactly, I'm not going to defend you, he said. I'm going to dissolve the hearing. The conduct in question occurred at my direct invitation under my personal authorization. The king can authorize private training. It's been in the palace rules since the second reign. The citation is procedurally invalid on those grounds. She thought about it. They'll say you're using an obscure rule to protect a personal interest, she said. They'll say that regardless, he said. At least this way the dismissal is on the record. And after the hearing? My standing is 9th. I don't make the final 5. I don't stand at the ball. He looked at her. I know, he said. The word landed between them with its full weight. He knew. She had not failed. She had been managed out of a position she had earned by people with more access to the levers of the system than she had, and there was no procedural correction that put her back in the top 5 before the ball happened. I don't regret dissolving the treaty, he said. She had no answer for that, which was also simple and also true, so she said nothing. She turned toward the healing ward. She needed Ordinary for a while. Ordinary kept her hands busy and her mind from circling. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard voices from the gallery level above, sound carrying through the stone at the early evening hour when the palace's formal motion had thinned. She slowed. Seraphine's voice, clear, north border cadenced, and beneath it, lower, Saevin. She stopped, pressed to the wall, listened. The council has authority to revisit an executive dissolution if it can demonstrate procedural error, Seven was saying. I need 48 hours. And the girl? Seraphine said. The hearing resolves that. Or, if the hearing fails, there's another mechanism. A pause. The ball requires the top 5. If the 9th position cannot advance regardless, the hearing becomes less urgent. What matters is that Kaelor doesn't act on his intentions before the ball. If he does, we lose the procedural window entirely. So you move before the hearing, Seraphine said. We move tonight, Saevin said. There's correspondence, notes, kept in her quarters. Once they're before the full council as evidence, the citation becomes secondary. The case stands on its own and cannot be dismissed by royal authorization because it was never about the training sessions. Elira pushed off the wall. Her quarters. Tonight. While she stood in this corridor, they were already inside or already done, and what they had taken was the notes, the 6-word summonses, the confession from the first night, the handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. And those were going before the full council as evidence of exactly the story Saevin had been constructing from the beginning. She moved, not running, but fast, with the focused precision of someone who has understood the exact shape and speed of what's coming and is calculating whether they can still reach where they need to be before it closes. She turned toward the king's chambers wing, 2 guards at the junction, different from the morning rotation, blocking the direct route. She turned and took the east corridor, then the passage behind the library. She was almost through when a step sounded behind her. Not boots, something lighter, deliberate, and she turned. Lady Seraphine stood 12 feet back in the corridor, not aggressive, not moving, composed in the way she was always composed, watching Elira with an expression that was not what Elira had prepared herself to find there. You should stop, Seraphine said. Her voice was not unkind. That was the most unsettling thing about it. The library passage is watched. Saevin posted someone 2 hours ago. Elira looked at her. Why are you telling me this? She said. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Something behind her composure moved, a thing she was weighing, deciding how honestly to set down. Because I came to this palace believing I was walking toward something real, she said. A king who had chosen. An alliance that meant something beyond the treaty document. She paused. I am not interested in being the instrument of something this dishonest. Elira held her gaze. There were many versions of this woman she had built in her mind over the past week. None of them had looked like this. Not like a person standing in a corridor at the edge of something, deciding where her own line was. The notes from my room, Elira said. Have they already been taken? An hour ago, Seraphine said. They'll be before the council before the second bell. Elira absorbed this. Use the kitchen corridor, Seraphine said. The servants' passage connects to the back approach of the chamber's wing. It isn't watched because Saivon doesn't know you know it exists. Elira looked at her for one more second. Then she moved. Kitchen corridor. She had known it since childhood, had navigated it 1,000 times in her mother's wake. She was through the door and moving, up the back stairs, along the outer passage, to the door of the king's private solar. She pushed it open without knocking. Kaelor was not alone. Lord Seven stood at the center of the room. 2 council members flanked him. On the desk between them and the king lay a document, formal council heading, and below it, laid out in the careful structure of a case built to withstand contestation, the notes. Her notes. His notes. The words she had read alone in her room and kept in her pocket, and eventually in her drawer because they had mattered to her in a way she hadn't wanted to expose by destroying them. Kaelor looked at her from across the room. His face was controlled. It was always controlled, but she had learned to read what lived behind it, and what she saw now was not anger, not calculation. It was something she had not seen on him before. The expression of a man who has just understood that the wall he has spent years building the empire against has found the one seam he had not reinforced. Saivon turned. Miss Voss, he said, with the precise courtesy of a man who had already won and could afford it. You're in time. The council has been reviewing some correspondence between yourself and the king. He gestured at the desk. We were about to invite you to respond. The room was very still. This is the moment that certain stories hinge on. Not the dramatic confrontations, not the battles, but the quiet ones. The moment where a person stands in a doorway and understands that every careful move they have made has been read, recorded, and recontextualized by people who were watching more carefully than they knew, and that there is no version of the next 60 seconds that does not cost something significant. Elira had spent 22 years being invisible. She had built her entire approach to this palace on the assumption that invisibility was the only reliable protection available to someone in her position. She had allowed herself for 3 weeks to be seen by one person in one yard at hours when no one was supposed to be watching, and those 3 weeks were now laid out on a desk in the king's solar as evidence of her own undoing. She looked at the notes on the desk. She looked at Saivon's face, composed and patient, and already writing the next paragraph of the story he was constructing. She looked at Kaelor, who was looking back at her with the quiet of a man waiting to see what she was going to do, not because he doubted her, she understood suddenly, but because he knew that what happened next had to come from her. Whatever she chose in this room was going to define what the next chapter of this story looked like. And a king who had already dissolved a treaty and exposed his own intentions could not make that choice for her without making her smaller in the making of it. She stepped fully into the room. She closed the door behind her. She walked to the desk, picked up the nearest note. The first one, 6 words, the night she had stood in the training yard for the first time, and held it in her hand and looked at Saivon with the expression she had used in the mediation trial and in the healing ward, and in every room in this palace that had required her to be more certain than she felt. You've built a very careful case, she said. Saivon's expression did not change. The correspondence speaks for itself. It does? She said. It speaks to a series of private training sessions authorized by the king himself, conducted in the palace's backyard, which is covered under royal authorization procedures that predate your tenure on this council by 60 years. She set the note back on the desk. What it does not speak to is any violation of tournament conduct, because conduct citations apply to candidate behavior at official tournament events and in interactions with the selecting party, Prince Rowan, not to interactions with any other member of the royal household, including the king. Saivon looked at her. The spirit of the rule, he began. I'm not interested in the spirit, she said. I'm interested in the text. Section 12, paragraph 4. Private conduct incompatible with the dignity of the selection process. The selection process is administered by Prince Rowan's office. Private interactions with the king fall outside that jurisdiction. She looked at him steadily. Your citation is procedurally unsound. Your complaint filing was not provided with the citation, which is a Section 15 violation. And your evidence, even if the citation were valid, describes conduct that falls outside the rule's jurisdictional scope. The room was very quiet. One of the council members flanking Savan shifted his weight slightly. Savan looked at her for a long moment. His composure was intact. It was very good composure, built over decades, tested in harder rooms than this one. But she had spent 3 weeks learning to read a man who had even better composure than Savan. And what she saw underneath his was not the confidence of a man who had won. It was the calculation of a man who was revising. The council has the authority to, he began. Lord Savan. Kaylor's voice came from behind the desk. Quiet. Final. The hearing is dismissed. The citation is dissolved on procedural grounds, effective immediately. You'll have the formal documentation from my office before morning. He looked at the 2 council members. You're dismissed, both of you. They left. Savan did not move for 3 seconds. Then he gathered the documents from the desk with the careful, precise movements of a man who was not finished but was choosing the moment to withdraw. He straightened. He looked at Elira one more time, not with malice, not with admiration, with the specific recalibrating attention of a man filing away new information about an opponent he had underestimated. He left without another word. The door closed. The room was empty except for the 2 of them, and the fire burning low in the hearth, and the documents still spread across the desk between them. Kaylor looked at her. She looked back. That was well done, he said. It was the truth, she said. Savan built a case on language that didn't say what he needed it to say. I just read it. Most people in that position would not have been able to read it, he said. She set the 6-word note back on the desk, gently. I'm still 9th, she said. Yes. I won't make the final 5. I won't stand at the ball. No. She looked at the notes on the desk, at his handwriting, precise and unornamented, visible in the firelight. The confession from the first night, the single word tonight, the things he had written to her when writing was the only thing he could offer without making her a target before she was already won. She had been a target anyway. That was the thing about visibility. You couldn't control who watched when you finally allowed yourself to be seen. You could choose to step into the light, but you couldn't choose who was standing in the dark beyond it. What happens now? She said. The ball is in 3 days, he said. The final 5 stand before the court. Rowan makes his selection. He paused. And I make mine. She looked at him. 7 will challenge it, she said. He still has the treaty dissolution to contest. If you publicly claim a woman who didn't finish in the top 5 of your brother's selection tournament, the council will use it as evidence of compromised judgment. They'll move to restrict your authority on the northern border decision. They may succeed. They may, he said. And that doesn't change what you're planning. No, he said. She stood in the solar with the fire going low, and the documents on the desk between them and the palace breathing its restless, indifferent breath around them, and she thought about what it cost, really cost, to stand in a room after everything had been exposed and simply say no, this does not change what I'm planning. She had thought for 22 years that invisibility was the only protection she had. She had been wrong. Invisibility was not protection. It was just a slower way of disappearing. Real protection was this, a thing so clear and so decided that no political mechanism could reframe it into something it wasn't. She picked up the notes from the desk, one by one, and held them. I'll be at the ball, she said. I know, he said. Not as a finalist, she said. Just present, whatever that means. It means everything, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the notes back down on the desk, not taking them with her this time, leaving them in the one place in the palace where they had always truthfully belonged, and she walked to the door. She stopped. Seraphine told me about the library passage, she said. She told me it was watched. She told me to use the kitchen corridor. She heard him absorb this. I'll thank her, he said. Elira opened the door. The corridor was quiet. The palace moved around her the way it always had, restless, layered, indifferent to the people navigating its interior. She walked through it back toward the healing ward, past the kitchen corridor that had brought her through in time, past the places she had navigated for 22 years while making herself small enough not to be noticed. She walked with her head straight. She had stepped into a room tonight without armor and without rank and without anything except an accurate reading of the text she'd been handed. And she had made Savon revise his calculation. She had survived the first full assault on everything she had allowed herself to want. 3 days to the ball. Savon was not finished. She knew that. A man like that did not leave a room and stop working. He left a room and found the next angle, the next lever, the next procedural mechanism that could be turned toward the outcome he'd already decided on. The treaty dissolution was still on the table. The council's authority to revisit it was still real. And somewhere in the palace, Lord Aldrich, whose name was on the complaint, whose connection to Savon ran through channels she hadn't yet fully mapped, was still present, still positioned, still watching. She reached the healing ward. Her mother was inside working late, not looking up when the door opened because she always knew Elira's step. "Well?" Marit said. "I'm still in the palace," Elira said. Marit was quiet for a moment, then, "That's enough for tonight." Elira sat down at the supply table and picked up the inventory list and began to work through it, item by item, in the familiar low light of the only room in this palace that had always belonged to her. But in the council chambers above, a lamp was still lit, and beneath it, Lord Seven was writing a letter. Not to Aldrich, not to the Carath delegation, to a name Elira did not yet know, in a part of the palace's political architecture she had not yet mapped, about a mechanism she had not yet found in the rules archive. The next move in a game that had not, despite everything that had happened tonight, actually ended. It had simply changed shape, and that new shape, the one Savon was currently putting to paper in a handwriting nothing like the king's, precise but cold, built for administration rather than confession, would arrive at the ball in a form that neither Elira nor Kalor had prepared for. Because the one thing that palace systems had always had over the individuals who moved through them was time. They had been running longer. They had more practice at survival than any one person could accumulate in a single lifetime, and they did not, ever, simply stop. The letter Savon wrote that night reached its recipient before dawn. Elira did not know this yet. She was in the healing ward when the sun came up, restocking shelves with the particular focused blankness of someone using familiar work to keep a mind from running ahead of itself. Her mother moved beside her without speaking, which was Marit's way of saying she understood that speech was not what was needed. The ward smelled of dried herbs and cold stone and the faint medicinal sharpness of the tinctures lined up in their labeled bottles. And it was the most honest smell in the palace. No politics in it, no calculation, just the straightforward business of keeping people alive. 3 days to the ball. She told herself it was enough time. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. The first sign came mid-morning. She was crossing the main corridor on her way to the supplies storeroom when she saw the envoy. Not a council runner, not a palace guard, but a formal diplomatic envoy in traveling clothes bearing a crest she had never seen before. Northern. Not Carath, something older, something that made the two guards flanking the main hall straighten with the instinctive deference of men who recognized a name they had been trained to respect. She didn't stop walking, but she filed it. The second sign came an hour later when Service appeared in the healing ward doorway with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead and his face doing the thing it did when he had information he had decided she needed. "There's been a motion before the council," he said. She set down the bottle she was holding. "What motion?" "Emergency petition. Filed this morning under the Imperial Governance Articles." He paused. "Article 31. Temporary restriction of executive authority when a ruling alpha's fitness to govern is under formal question." The ward went very quiet. Article 31 was a ghost clause. She had heard it mentioned exactly once in 22 years, in a conversation between two senior court historians arguing about whether it had ever been properly invoked in the Empire's history. It required a supermajority of the full council, a formal allegation, and a presenting party with sufficient standing. It was not a weapon anyone reached for lightly, because the political cost of invoking it and failing was severe enough to end careers. Someone had decided the political cost was worth it. "Who filed it?" she said. "Lord Aldrich," Service said, co-signed by 6 council members, including Lord Sivan. The presenting party... He paused again, more carefully this time. is the northern envoy who arrived this morning, House Merath, Old Blood. Their claim is that the king's dissolution of the Karath negotiation without council ratification represents a unilateral destabilization of northern border security and warrants formal review of his executive fitness. House Merath. The crest she had filed an hour ago. They had been contacted before Saivan left the Solar last night. The letter. The name she hadn't known. Saivan had spent the afternoon building the citation case and simultaneously sending word north, and the Northern House had moved with a speed that meant they had been prepared in advance, that this contingency, this specific sequence, had been planned for longer than the past 48 hours. She breathed. "What does the article do?" she said. "In practice, what does it actually do?" "While the petition is under formal review," Service said, "the king's executive decisions are subject to council countersignature. He cannot act unilaterally in matters of state." A pause. "Including matters pertaining to the Grand Moon Ball." She understood. He could not formally claim her at the ball if Article 31 was active. Any public act that could be characterized as a political decision, and claiming a Luna in front of the full assembled court was exactly that, would require council ratification. And the council, as currently composed, would not ratify it. Saivan had not come back for a second round. He had come back with a different weapon entirely, and this one did not have a procedural vulnerability she could find in 40 minutes in the rules archive. "When does the review convene?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Service said. "The day before the ball." He left. Elira stood in the ward and thought about the shape of it, the full, complete, elegant shape of what Saivan had built over the course of a single night. He had not needed to stop her. He had not needed to remove her from the palace or revoke her tournament standing or manufacture a scandal. He had simply needed to cage the king for 48 hours. Everything else would resolve itself because a ball would happen, and a selection would be made, and Rowan would choose one of the 5 finalists, and without Kaelor's ability to formally act, what lived between them would remain exactly where it had always been, private, deniable, and consequentially inert. It was brilliant. She hated it with a precision that felt almost like respect. She took off her apron. "Where are you going?" her mother said. "To find out if the king has a legal strategy yet," she said. Elira. "I know," she said. She stopped in the doorway. She turned back and looked at her mother, this small, precise woman who had spent 19 years building a life in the gap between proximity and belonging, who had raised a daughter in the same gap and taught her, by example rather than instruction, how to survive inside it. "I know what I'm walking into." Marit looked at her for a long moment. "Then walk into it like you know," she said. Elira went. She found Kaelor not in the Solar but in the war room, the long chamber on the eastern side of the palace with the large map table at its center that she had never been inside before. The door was open. He was alone, standing at the map table with both hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular with the focused stillness of a man doing mathematics in his head. He looked up when she came in. "You heard?" he said. "Service told me." She crossed to the table. "Article 31. Yes. Have you spoken to your legal counsel?" "For 3 hours this morning." His jaw was set. "The petition is technically valid. Aldrich's co-signatures meet the supermajority threshold. House Merath has standing as an affected northern party. The review convenes tomorrow." He looked at the map. "My counsel's position is that I can contest the fitness allegation on the merits. The treaty dissolution was legally within my executive authority, and the northern border situation is more stable than Merath's petition claims. But contesting on those merits requires a formal proceeding that runs longer than 48 hours. So the ball happens during the review," she said. "Yes. And during the review, you can't act." "Correct." She looked at the map table, routes, borders, the ink-stained cartography of an empire that had been held together for 7 years by one man's willingness to make every choice the correct one. She thought about what it cost, not in the abstract, but specifically, to be the person everyone depended on to make the correct choice. She thought about what it did to a person over 7 years, the way it made you precise and careful and extraordinarily good at managing situations, and the way it stripped out, slowly and without announcement, the capacity for anything that couldn't be justified by the same logic that ran the empire. She thought about a man who had watched a 17-year-old girl correct a physician's notation and said nothing for 5 years because saying something was not the correct choice. She thought about what it meant that he had finally stopped making the correct choice. "There's a way through this," she said. He looked at her. "The petition requires a formal review," she said. "But the review is not the ball. They're separate proceedings on separate timelines. Article 31 restricts executive decisions in matters of state during the review period." She met his gaze. "Claiming a Luna is not a matter of state." "The Council will argue it is." "The Council will argue everything is a matter of state if it serves them," she said. "But the legal text of Article 31 is specific. Executive decisions in matters of governance and foreign affairs. A personal declaration, a public statement of intent, not a formal state act, falls outside the article's jurisdictional language." She paused. "The same way the training sessions fell outside Section 12. He was very still. "You've been in the archive again," he said. "I've been in the archive since 4 this morning," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in the same neighborhood. The specific fractional softening of a man who has spent years being the most prepared person in any given room and has just encountered someone keeping pace. "Even if you're right about the jurisdictional language," he said, "making a public declaration at the ball, while Article 31 is active, will be characterized as defiance of the review process. The political cost." "I know the political cost," she said. "I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm telling you what's legally defensible." She looked at him steadily. "What you do with that is your decision." He held her gaze. There are moments in a person's life, not many, but real ones, where the path forward requires them to step away from every system of justification they have built over years of careful living and simply act from the part of themselves that the justification was always, underneath everything, protecting. These moments are terrifying, not because the action is unclear, but because the clarity of it removes every excuse for hesitation, and hesitation is the last shelter available to someone who has spent a long time being careful. Kaylor was out of hesitation. She could see it in the quality of the stillness he was standing in, not the stillness of a man managing a situation, but the stillness of a man who had already decided and was simply present in the space between decision and action. "The ball is tomorrow night," he said. "Yes." "Whatever I do, Savan will respond." "Yes." "And you understand that the response will be directed at you as much as at me." She looked at him. "I entered a tournament I was probably going to lose," she said. "I've been in this palace for 22 years, surviving things that were directed at me. I understand what I'm in." She paused. "Do you understand what you're in?" "Yes," he said. No hesitation. "Then we deal with tomorrow when it comes," she said. She left the war room. The day moved through the palace with the particular pressurized pace of the day before something large. Everyone aware that something was coming. The awareness making the ordinary rhythms of the palace feel slightly off-tempo, like music played at the wrong speed. The ball preparations were underway. Banners hung, floors polished. The Great Hall transformed with the kind of elaborate and expensive effort that courts make when they are performing themselves for an audience that includes their own reflection. Elira worked the healing ward through the afternoon. She redressed a guard's training injury. She consulted with her mother on a fever case in the servant quarters. She did the inventory she had been putting off for a week. She kept her hands moving because moving hands were the most reliable way she had found to keep her mind from running to places she couldn't afford to be yet. At the late bell, Rowan came to find her. He appeared in the healing ward doorway in the casual clothes of a man who had slipped away from something formal, and he had the look of someone who had been thinking about this visit for a while and had decided the thinking was less useful than the doing. She set down what she was holding. "You've heard about the petition," he said. "Yes." He came in, sat on the edge of the supply table with the easy physical comfort of a man who had always occupied space without worrying about it. She had loved that ease once, had mistaken it for something simpler and better than what it actually was, which was the ease of a man who had never needed to worry about what his presence cost. "Seven doesn't answer to me," he said. "I've never had the political relationship with the council that Kaylor has. But I have," he paused, choosing, "I have some ability to create difficulty for a petition that is being driven by a personal agenda rather than a genuine governance concern. She looked at him. "What kind of difficulty?" she said. "The ball is my event," he said. "The selection is my selection. If I characterize any interference with the ball's proceedings as interference with my authority as the selecting party." He paused. "That creates a conflict of jurisdiction that Saivan will have to navigate around." "That's a genuine offer," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. She thought about 8 years. She thought about the healer's daughter and the prince and the particular, comfortable distance that had always been between them and that she had mistaken, for so long, for proximity. She thought about what it meant that the man she had crossed a palace for was sitting on her supply table offering to create a jurisdictional conflict on her behalf. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because I've been watching my brother for 7 years," he said, "and I have never once seen him look at anything the way he looks at you. And because I should have looked at you more carefully myself, and I didn't. And this is the version of making that right that's actually available to me." She held that. "Thank you," she said. It was not nothing. She meant it completely. He nodded once. He left. Morning came with the weight of everything that was about to happen, sitting on the palace like a weather system moving in from the north. The Article 31 review convened at the first bell in the formal council chamber. Elira was not present. She had no standing in a council proceeding, but service sent word at the second bell. Kaylor's counsel was contesting the fitness allegation on the merits. The proceeding would not resolve before the ball, and the restriction on executive action was therefore active through the evening, active through the ball. She went back to the archive. She read the Article 31 text again, every word, every clause. She read the definitions section at the back of the governance articles that specified what constituted a matter of state versus a matter of personal prerogative. She read the precedent cases her mother had once told her existed somewhere in the palace records, from the Third Reign, when a different article had been used for a similar purpose, and the king at the time had found a different way through. She found what she was looking for at the third bell. Personal declarations of intent made in a public forum prior to formal state ratification are categorized as prerogative acts, not executive decisions, and are not subject to the restrictions applicable to ratified state acts under any governance article. Prerogative acts. Personal declarations of intent. She sat in the archive with the document in her hands and thought about what it meant, and whether it was enough, and whether Saivan had read this particular footnote in the definition section of the governance articles when he had drafted the petition, or whether his legal team had missed it, the way anyone could miss something buried in a footnote at the back of a document most people only read once. She thought he had probably missed it. She thought this because Saivan was brilliant at operating systems but had a blind spot for prerogative, the acts that fell outside the system's formal structure, not because they were illegal but because they were too personal to have been anticipated by the architecture of rules written to govern institutional decisions. He had been thinking about the king's executive authority. He had not been thinking about the king's personal voice in a public room. That was the gap. She left the archive. She had 4 hours until the ball. She went to find Kaylor. He was in the solar, dressed for the evening, going over the last of the review documents with his counsel. He looked up when she came in. His counsel looked at her with the expression of a man who had been briefed on the situation and had professional feelings about it that he was maintaining the discipline not to express. She looked at Kaylor. "Prerogative acts," she said. Definitions section, Governance Articles, page 37. A personal declaration of intent made in a public forum before formal state ratification is categorized as a prerogative act, not an executive decision, and is not subject to Article 31 restrictions. The counsel turned to look at her. His expression shifted. Kaylor said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he looked at his counsel. "Is she right?" he said. The counsel pulled the document toward him. He found the page. He read it. He read it again. "Technically," he said slowly, "yes." "Saivan will challenge it," Kaylor said. "Saivan can challenge a prerogative act after the fact," the counsel said. "He cannot restrict it before it happens." That's the distinction. The article prevents executive decisions, which are subject to prior countersignature. A prerogative act is prior to and outside the countersignature process by definition. He paused. "If you make a public declaration tonight before any formal state instrument is signed, the declaration itself is protected. Seven can argue about what comes after. He cannot stop the declaration from being made. The room was quiet for a moment. Kaylor looked at Elira. She looked back. "You've been in the archive since this morning," he said. "Since before this morning," she said. Something happened in his face that she had not seen before and would not have been able to name precisely. Not relief, not the warmth of simple gratitude, but something more complex and more structural. The expression of a man discovering that the thing he had chosen was built of the same material he was built of, and finding in that discovery a kind of bedrock he had not known he needed. "Go get ready for this ball," he said. Not an instruction. The tone was different from instruction. It was the voice he used in the training yard when she had done something correctly, and he was telling her to move to the next thing. She went. Her mother was waiting in her room with a dress Elira had not seen before. Not palace finery, nothing borrowed from a noble house, but something that was plainly beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are made honestly. Dark fabric, good cut, nothing performative. Her mother had made it, she realized. Maret had made it and said nothing about making it, which was consistent with everything her mother had ever done for her. The help that never announced itself as help. She dressed. She looked at herself in the mirror. She did not look like a finalist. She did not look like a noble candidate or a ranked competitor or any of the versions of women this ball had been designed to celebrate. She looked like herself, 22 years old, the daughter of a healer, underfunded and overprepared, with a split lip from a combat trial still faintly visible, and a jaw that was perhaps too set and eyes that had been awake for too many consecutive hours. She looked, for the first time, like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Grand Moon Ball opened at the 7th bell. The Great Hall was everything the preparations had promised, crystal and candlelight, and the massed presence of everyone who mattered in the Empire of Valdaris, organized into the careful hierarchies of a court that had been performing itself for centuries. Foreign dignitaries along the east wall, noble families at the tiered tables, the tournament assessors in their formal positions, the 5 finalists in a line before the dais, wearing the colors of their respective houses, composed and beautiful and trained for exactly this moment. Elira stood at the back of the hall, not invisible. She had stopped being invisible, but present in the way she had always been present in rooms that weren't built for her, aware of every angle, every exit, every person in the room who was watching something other than the official proceedings. Saivan was in the 3rd row, beside the Mayroth envoy. She found him without looking for him, the way you found sources of pressure in a room without being told where they were. He had not yet seen the footnote. She could tell by the quality of his composure. Still confident, still the composure of a man who had planned for every variable. He did not yet know about the prerogative act distinction. He would know soon. Rowan came to the dais. He was dressed for the occasion and wore it with the ease he wore everything, and he looked out at the assembled court with the smile that had always been his best feature. Genuine enough to be persuasive, controlled enough to be safe. He began the formal proceedings. The 5 finalists were presented. Elira watched them. Vera Kane, hard and honest and genuinely impressive. 3 noble daughters whose names she had learned over 5 weeks of watching them compete. And a woman named Aurora, from the middle of the standings, who had risen in the final week through a combination of quiet intelligence and the specific, unhurried competence of someone who had stopped trying to perform and started trying to actually do the thing. She had noticed Aurora. She had thought, watching her in the 4th phase trials, that Aurora was the kind of person who would be good for Rowan in the way that mattered most. Not dramatically, not as a story, but practically, in the long run of it. The formal declaration would come after the finalists' presentations. Rowan would speak. He would make his selection, and somewhere in that sequence, if everything held the way the footnote on page 37 said it could hold, she felt the shift before she saw it, a movement in the 3rd row. Savan leaning to his counsel, something being passed, a document, she thought, folded small. The counsel reading it quickly. Savan's face doing something she had never seen it do before. Losing. For a brief and uncontrolled moment, the composure it had maintained through every preceding confrontation. He had found the footnote, or someone had found it for him. She watched him straighten. She watched him look across the room, not at Kaylor, not at Rowan, but at her. Directly. With the specific, recalibrated attention of a man who has just understood that the variable he underestimated was, in fact, the mechanism that had undone him. She held his gaze. She did not look away first this time. Savan turned and said something to the Merath envoy. The envoy shook his head slightly. Not agreement, something closer to resignation. Whatever move remained, it was not the one Savan had been holding. Rowan was finishing the formal presentations. The hall was very quiet in the way that large spaces go quiet when something is about to happen that everyone present can feel approaching. Kaler was standing to the right of the dais. Not on it, beside it, in the position of a king who had attended his brother's event rather than presided over it. He had been there when she arrived. She had not looked at him directly until now. He was looking at her. Across the full length of the hall, through the candlelight and the assembled court and the 5 finalists and the weight of everything that the past 5 weeks had built and broken and rebuilt in a shape neither of them had planned for. He was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in the training yard on the 12th night, when she had said his name and he had gone still in a way that was not control but its absence. Rowan stepped forward. "I've spent 5 weeks watching 36 women compete for a place in this empire," he said. His voice carried the hall easily. "I've watched them fight and strategize and lead and fail and get back up. I've watched them be exactly what they were trained to be." He paused. "And I've watched one woman be exactly what no one trained her to be. Herself. Unhesitatingly, inconveniently, at considerable personal cost." He smiled, and it was the most honest version of his smile she had ever seen. "So I'm going to ask Lady Aurora of the Crestfield Pack to stand with me, because she is, without question, the right choice." He looked at Aurora. "And because the person I just described isn't competing for my hand." The hall absorbed this. Aurora stepped forward with the composed grace of someone who had not entirely known this was coming and was processing it with remarkable speed. Savan was on his feet. "Your Majesty," he started, directing it at Kaler. "Lord Savan." Rowan's voice cut across the hall with a sharpness she had not heard from him before. "This is my selection event. You will wait." Savan went still, and Kaler stepped forward from beside the dais. The hall went completely silent, not the polite silence of ceremony. The held breath silence of a room full of people who understand, in their collective body, that something is about to happen that has not been planned for and cannot be recalled once it begins. Kaler walked the length of the dais. He did not look at Savan. He did not look at the council. He did not look at the Myrath envoy, or the Karath delegation, or the assessors, or the banners, or any of the apparatus of the empire that had shaped every decision he had made for 7 years. He looked at her. He walked toward her through the candlelit hall, through the assembled court of Valderis, past the ranked tables and the foreign dignitaries and the tournament finalists, and the full weight of every political consequence that was going to follow from this single act. And he walked with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who has made the calculation and found that the calculation does not matter as much as the direction. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. The hall was so quiet she could hear the candles. "This is a prerogative act," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. A private word in a public room, the specific inversion of everything they had been forced to navigate. Not an executive decision. "I know," she said. "Page 37. "Page 37, he said. He reached for her hand, and behind him, across the length of the hall, Lord Savan took a step forward with the expression of a man who has one move left and knows exactly what it costs to play it. And in his hand, held up for the court to see, was a document bearing a seal she did not recognize, from a name she had never heard, invoking an instrument she had not yet found in any archive. Something older than Article 31. Something that had not been used in the Empire's history for reasons no one in the hall, in that moment, could immediately name. "Your Majesty," Savan said, and his voice was completely controlled and completely cold. "Before this court and these witnesses, I invoke the Crown Tribunal." The words landed in the silence like a stone in still water. She felt Kaler's hand tighten on hers. She looked at his face. For the first time since she had known him, she could not read what was behind the control. And that, more than anything Savan had done or said in 5 weeks of maneuvering, was what told her that whatever the Crown Tribunal was, it was the thing that Savan had been saving. The real weapon. The one he had kept in reserve for exactly this moment, when the king's hand was in hers and the hall was watching, and there was no procedural footnote on any page of any archive that she had found. The hall did not move. The candles burned, and Kaylor turned to face Savon across the length of the room, with Elira's hand still in his and the full court of Valderis as witness, and said nothing. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is simply stand still and make the other person show the rest of their hand. The Crown Tribunal. Elira felt Kaylor's hand tighten on hers. Not a flinch, not a retreat, just the single, involuntary contraction of a man whose body had registered something before his face permitted it. She filed that away. She had learned over 5 weeks that his body told the truth slightly faster than his expression did. And the truth his body was telling right now was that the Crown Tribunal was not a procedural mechanism he had anticipated. That alone told her it was serious. The hall had not moved. 300 people holding the particular stillness of a crowd that has just heard something it doesn't fully understand and is waiting for someone with more information to react first. The candles threw their light across faces arranged in various configurations of confusion, calculation, and the specific alert attention of people who understood that something historic was unfolding in front of them and were deciding how to position themselves relative to it. Seven held the document up for the court to see. Steady, controlled. The composure of a man who had been waiting a long time for this specific moment and was going to occupy it without rushing. The Crown Tribunal, he said, addressing the hall rather than any individual, is an instrument established in the second reign of Valderis, predating every governance article and every council procedure currently in use. It convenes when the crown itself, not the king's executive authority, but the legitimacy of the crown's current holder, is formally questioned by a coalition of noble houses with sufficient combined territorial holding. He paused. The instrument requires a 2/3 territorial majority of the empire's noble houses to invoke. I have secured that majority. The documentation is before you. He set the document on the table beside him and stepped back. The Crown Tribunal does not restrict executive authority, he said. It does not proceed through council review. It convenes before the assembled noble houses of the empire, and it asks a single question, whether the current holder of the crown has demonstrated the fitness, judgment, and integrity required to lead. He looked at Kaylor across the length of the room. It is not a legal proceeding. It is a reckoning. And it cannot be appealed, footnoted, or circumvented by prerogative act. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence that had preceded it. Elira felt the weight of the hall shift, not against Kaylor, not yet, but toward the particular suspended state of people waiting to see what the man at the center of it was going to do. She had felt that weight in the social trials when she had stood in the center of the mediation scenario. She had felt it in the training yard in the middle of a pattern that was harder than she could manage and needed to be managed anyway. She recognized it as the specific gravity of a moment that required someone to be more decided than they felt. She looked at Kaylor. He was looking at Savon. His face was the most controlled she had ever seen it. Not the control of suppression, but the control of a man who has moved past the reaction phase and is already operating in the response, who has assessed the instrument, the terrain, and the available moves, and has arrived at the one he is going to make. He turned to the hall. "Then we convene," he said. Not a concession, not a capitulation. The flat forward statement of a man who has decided that the only way through a thing is directly through it and has stopped being interested in alternatives. Savon had expected something else. She could see it, a fractional recalibration in his composure, the adjustment of a man whose plan assumed a different first response. He had expected the king to contest the legitimacy of the instrument, to call for legal review, to do the thing that powerful men generally did when confronted with a formal challenge to their authority, which was buy time while their counsel found the angle. Kaylor had not bought time. He had said yes. The hall moved into the rearrangement that a tribunal required, the noble houses identifying themselves, taking positions along the tiered floor, the Marath envoy moving to join his Valdaris counterparts in the formal witness positions. Savon's coalition of signatories arranged themselves to his right, 7 lords whose territorial holdings Elira did not have time to calculate, but whose combined mass clearly met whatever threshold the instrument required. Kaylor released her hand. She looked at him. "Stay in the room," he said. Quiet. Not instruction. Request. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He moved to the center of the hall. This is the thing that no amount of preparation for power can actually prepare a person for. The moment when the systems they have built, the careful structures they have spent years constructing, are stripped away, and what remains is simply them, their word, their record, the unadorned fact of what they have been and what they have done. Kaelor had ruled Valdaris for 7 years through intelligence and precision and the accumulated credibility of a man who had never, until recently, allowed personal desire to complicate political necessity. That record was the only argument he had left. Savan had not brought a legal case. He had brought a mirror. Lord Savan, Kaelor said, addressing the room, has invoked the Crown Tribunal on the grounds that my decisions over the past weeks demonstrate compromised fitness to lead. Specifically, the dissolution of the Karath Treaty negotiation and my actions tonight. He looked around the hall, not defensively, not with the performed confidence of a man building to a speech, but with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who is going to tell the truth and is giving the room the courtesy of his actual attention before he does. He is correct that I dissolved the Karath negotiation. He is correct about my actions tonight. He is not correct about what they demonstrate. Savan spoke from his position. The Karath passes represent the Empire's most strategically significant northern access route. Dissolving that negotiation without council ratification was within my executive authority, Kaelor said, which my council has already established before the review committee. But that's not the argument I'm making. He paused. I'm making a different one. The hall waited. The Crown Tribunal asks whether the Crown's holder has demonstrated fitness, judgment, and integrity, Kaelor said. I want to address each of those, not because the tribunal compels me to, but because this court deserves an honest account from its king rather than a legal defense. He looked at the assembled noble houses. 7 years ago, I took this crown at 23 after my father died and left an empire in active border conflict on 3 fronts. In 7 years, I have closed those conflicts, stabilized 4 treaty relationships, rebuilt the Eastern Trade Corridor, and held the Northern Passage through a combination of negotiation and the credible threat of force that I was prepared to make good on. He paused. I have done all of that correctly. I have made every major decision with the Empire's interests as the primary consideration and my own interests as secondary or absent. Savan said nothing. He was listening. 3 weeks ago, I made a decision that was not correct, Kaelor said. I dissolved a politically sound treaty negotiation because the woman I intended to make my Luna was not named in that treaty, and I was no longer willing to act as though the treaty mattered more than she did. He looked at Savan directly. That was not a decision made in the Empire's interest. It was a decision made in mine. A pause. I'm not going to tell you it was otherwise. The hall absorbed this. Elira stood at the edge of it and felt the weight of what he was doing. Not building a defense, not finding the legal angle, not managing the narrative. Telling the truth. In front of 300 people in a formal tribunal instrument and the full assembled court of the Empire he had held together for 7 years. He was simply telling the truth about what he had done and why. She had never seen a king do that. She was not certain she had ever seen a person do it, in a room where the cost of doing it was this high. The question the tribunal is actually asking, Kaelor continued, is not whether I made a politically correct decision. It's whether a king who makes a decision from personal conviction rather than political calculation has disqualified himself from the crown. He looked around the room. I'd like to put that question back to this court, because I believe the answer you give tells you more about the kind of empire you want to live in than it tells you about me. Silence. Savan stepped forward. The empire's stability cannot be subordinated to a king's personal. Lord Savan. The voice that cut across him was not Kaelor's. It was Rowan's. The prince moved from his position beside the dais into the center of the hall with the easy, unhurried stride of a man who had decided something and was done deliberating about it. He stopped beside his brother. He looked at Savan with the expression Elira had seen briefly in the healing ward, the honest version of him, underneath the charm, the version that had less performance in it and more person. I've listened to you invoke 3 separate mechanisms in the past 48 hours to prevent my brother from acting on a personal decision, Rowan said. A citation, a governance article, and now a tribunal instrument that hasn't been used in 4 reigns. He paused. I want to ask you something, and I want the court to hear the answer. What is the actual threat here? Name it plainly, not in procedural language. What are you afraid of? Sevan looked at him. The precedent, Sevan said after a moment. A king who dissolves a critical treaty for personal reasons sets a precedent that personal reasons are sufficient justification for executive decisions. That is not a stable basis for governance. And a king who has never once acted from personal conviction, Rowan said, is not a person. He's a function, and functions don't hold empires together. People do. He looked at the assembled houses. My brother has held this empire for 7 years through the kind of sustained, disciplined, self-abnegating commitment to correct governance that most rulers manage for 2 or 3 years before the weight of it breaks something in them. He has not broken. He has built. He paused. And the single time, he makes a decision that is his rather than the empire's. We're invoking instruments from the second reign to strip the crown from him. Bolpash. The hall was very quiet. Something had shifted in it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a tide shifts. The weight of the room was moving. Saevin felt it. She could see him feeling it, the composure adjusting, the calculation running, the assessment of whether the remaining moves were sufficient to reverse what was happening. The tribunal requires a response from the noble houses, Saevin said. He was not conceding. He was retreating to the instrument's formal structure, which was the move of a man who still believed the mechanism could save what the argument had not. Each house must declare. A 2/3 majority sustains the tribunal's finding. The declarations began. Elira watched them, lord by lord, house by house, the formal declarations moving around the room with the ritualized weight of something very old being put to use in a moment it had been designed for. Savin's coalition held through the first several. She counted, tracked, felt the balance of the room as it moved, and then Lord Aldrich stood. She had not expected this. She had spent 5 weeks mapping Aldrich as Savin's instrument, the name on the complaint, the co-signature on the petition, the senior council member whose authority had given the machinery its first and most important push. She had thought of him as a fixed element in Savin's structure. Aldrich stood, and the room waited, and he looked at Kaelor for a long moment with the expression of a man doing something that cost him something real. House Aldrich, he said, does not sustain the tribunal. The room moved. 2 more houses followed Aldrich within the minute, not Savin's coalition, holdouts who had been watching the room shift and had made their calculation. Then a 3rd. The math changed. The 2/3 threshold moved out of reach with the precision of a tide finding its natural level. Seven stood in the center of the hall and looked at the final count with the expression of a man who has spent a very long time building something and is watching it fail, not through external force, but through the simple, accumulated weight of people deciding it wasn't worth sustaining. The tribunal did not find against the crown. The hall breathed. In the aftermath of great confrontations, there is always a moment that the stories tend to skip over. The moment between the resolution and the beginning of what comes after, where the people at the center of everything have to simply stand in the space the conflict has vacated and figure out what they are now that the fight is done. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not have the sharpness of confrontation or the clarity of decision. It is quiet and slightly disorienting and more honest, in its way, than anything that preceded it. Kaelor stood in the center of the hall. Elira walked to him. Not running, not rushing. She walked across the polished floor of the great hall with 300 people watching and her ankle aching and her heart doing something loud and disorganized in her chest that she had given up trying to regulate. And she stopped in front of him, and she looked up at him, and she said nothing for a moment because nothing was required yet. He looked at her. "Prerogative Act," he said, quietly. "Prerogative Act," she confirmed. He reached for her hand again. This time no one in the hall moved to stop it. What followed was not, by the standards of what had preceded it, dramatic. There was no proclamation with the weight of ceremony, no theatrical declaration before the assembled court. Kaelor simply held her hand in the center of the hall and turned to face the room, and in the particular quality of that turn, its completeness, its total absence of apology or performance, the declaration made itself without requiring words. Rowan caught her eye from across the room. He smiled. The honest version, the one she had learned to recognize. She smiled back. Savan collected his documents from the table beside him with the careful movements of a man whose composure was still intact, but was now performing a different function. Not the composure of a man who had won, the composure of a man who had lost with enough control to make the loss survivable. She watched him do it, and felt something she had not anticipated feeling toward him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the recognition of a shared condition. He had spent years believing the empire's stability required the management of the things the king was not supposed to want. He had been wrong about what those things cost, and he had been wrong about whether the empire could survive them, but the concern underneath the maneuvering had been real. You could think a person was wrong about everything and still understand what drove them, and understanding was not the same thing as excusing, but it was, in its way, the more difficult and more honest response. He left the hall without incident. Lord Aldrich passed her on the way out. He did not speak, but he looked at her once, briefly, with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was still processing, and inclined his head slightly, and continued. She thought about what it had cost him. She thought about the weight of long institutional loyalty, meeting the moment where that loyalty required you to choose what it was actually for. She was still thinking about it when the hall began to move, the careful, post-ceremony dispersal of a court that had witnessed something it would be discussing for a very long time and was already arranging the memory of it into the version it intended to carry forward. Kaler drew her out of the hall through the side passage that connected to the palace's upper corridor. Not urgently, not hiding, just choosing a different pace than the crowd. His hand was still in hers. The contact was simple, and she had stopped being surprised by it, which was, she thought, its own kind of arrival. They came out on the upper corridor that ran the length of the palace's eastern face. The windows here looked out over the city below the palace walls. Valderis at night, lit by the particular amber and white of a city that had been doing this for a long time and had no plans to stop. The mountains beyond it were visible in the moonlight, their ridges dark against a sky that was very clear and very cold and very old. They stood at the window. Seven will rebuild, she said. Yes, Kaler said. The Marath envoy will go home and report that the tribunal failed. The northern border situation will need to be addressed through a different negotiation. The council will have a period of instability while the coalition that supported the petition reconfigures. Yes, he said, all of that is going to take significant work. Yes, he said. He looked at her. Are you listing the consequences to make sure I've considered them, or to give yourself a reason to reconsider? She thought about it honestly. Neither, she said. I'm listing them because they're real and because I'm going to be part of managing them, and I want you to know that I understand what that means. He was quiet for a moment. Part of managing them, he said. I'm not decorative, she said. I'm not going to stand beside you at formal occasions and be visible and let the palace run around me. I spent 22 years invisible in this palace. I know where every lever is. I know which corridors connect where. I know what the council minutes say and what they don't say, and how the gap between those two things tends to work. She looked at him. I'm useful. I intend to be useful. Something in his face, the thing she had no precise name for, the thing that lived in the space between his control and whatever the control was protecting, moved with the kind of completeness she had only seen in it a handful of times. And each time it had felt like watching something very large make a decision to stop being in motion. I know you're useful, he said. I've known it since you were 17 and corrected a physician's notation in the back of a certification hearing. You're going to keep bringing that up, she said. Probably forever, he said. She laughed. It came out unexpected, the way real laughter does. Not performed, not polished, just the sudden physical fact of finding something genuinely, helplessly funny after a very long time of finding nothing funny at all. It lasted longer than she expected and left her slightly breathless, and she didn't attempt to manage it, because she had spent enough time managing things in the past 5 weeks, and this was not a thing that required it. He watched her laugh with the expression of a man who has discovered a new thing and has immediately understood that it is one of the most important things he has ever encountered. When she finished, the corridor was quiet. The city below went about its business. The mountains held their positions. The palace breathed around them with its old, restless indifference to the people navigating its interior, which had not changed and would not change regardless of what happened inside it, because palaces were built to outlast the people who filled them, and had a long institutional practice of doing exactly that. What happens now, she said. It was the same question she had asked in the solar 3 days ago. He gave her a different answer this time. Now, he said, we go back inside. There are about 40 people in that hall who need to speak with me before the night is over, and there is a full council restructuring that needs to begin tomorrow, and the Mayrath situation requires direct diplomatic contact within the week. He looked at her. And you're going to tell me what you actually know about the northern border geography, because your assessment of the training trial format suggests you have a working knowledge of territorial strategy that I have not been utilizing. She looked at him. I've been reading the war room maps for 3 weeks, she said. I know, he said. I noticed. You didn't say anything? I was waiting to see what you did with it, he said. This was, she thought, the most accurate summary of the relationship she had any experience of. A man who saw things clearly and waited to see what you did with what you were capable of, and who had been doing this apparently for 5 years before she had any idea he was watching at all. She thought about all the versions of invisible she had been in this palace, all the corridors she had learned to navigate by necessity rather than belonging, all the years of making herself small enough to fit in the gap between proximity to power and access to it. She thought about a wrong door on a night she had been bracing herself to confess something she had been carrying so long it had stopped feeling like longing and started feeling like furniture. She thought about cold tea and a note with 6 words and a practice blade set against the wall of a training yard in the late dark of a palace that never slept. She thought about page 37. She thought about her mother in the healing ward, small and precise and honest, who had made a dress without being asked and said everything that mattered in 2 sentences and sent her daughter into the storm without trying to stop her, which was the most complete form of love Elira had ever personally witnessed. She thought about what it meant to have spent 22 years surviving a place and to find out, at 22, that surviving it was not the same as living inside it, and that the difference between those 2 things was a door you walked through wrong and found something waiting on the other side that had been waiting, apparently, for 5 years. The people who need to speak with you tonight, she said, are any of them going to be problems? Lord Fenrath from the Eastern Coalition, Kaelor said. He voted against the tribunal, but he's going to want assurances about the trade corridor negotiations. And the Karath delegation, Seraphine's father will want to reopen contact through a face-saving mechanism, she said. Something that lets him present the dissolution as a mutual reconsideration rather than a rejection. He's a pragmatist. He can work with that. Kaelor looked at her. How do you know that? He said. I've been watching people manage pride in this palace for 22 years, she said. A pragmatist who loses something always wants the story that lets him come back to the table later. You give him that and you get the Karath passes through a different arrangement that doesn't require Seraphine. She paused. Probably a trade agreement instead of a marriage. Less emotionally complex. More durable. He was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this, he said. Since the night after the 3rd trial, she said. I needed to understand what dissolving the Karath negotiation would actually cost, so I could understand what you were actually doing when you did it. And what was I actually doing? He said. She looked at him. Deciding that the correct choice and the right choice were not the same thing, she said, and choosing the right one. He held her gaze. This is finally what this story has always been about. Not the tournament, not the tribunal, not the political mechanisms or the governance articles or the footnotes in the definitions section of the Second Reign's imperial codes. It has been about the particular and costly human act of choosing something true over something correct, and the specific courage required to do that in a room, or a palace, or an empire that has organized itself entirely around the preference for correct over true. Kaelor had built his reign on correct choices, and those correct choices had kept the empire standing, and they were worth what they had cost. But a person cannot live on correct choices alone any more than a kingdom can survive on fear alone. Something has to be built for the person inside the king, or eventually the king runs out of the thing that makes the correct choices worth making. He had found that thing. It had found him back. They walked back into the palace together, side by side, through the upper corridor and down the wide staircase to the main hall, where 40 people were waiting with their various urgent concerns and their carefully arranged expressions and their long institutional memories of every precedent that had preceded tonight's addition to the record. Elira walked into the hall and felt the room adjust around her. The subtle, collective shift of 300 people recalibrating their understanding of who she was and what space she occupied and what that meant for how they would need to navigate their relationship to the crown going forward. It was not comfortable, that shift. It was not designed to be. It was simply true, which was, she had decided, the category of things she was going to insist on from now on. Lord Fenrath found them first, as predicted. She stood beside Kaelor while Fenrath made his case about the Eastern Trade Corridor, and she listened to the way the concern was phrased and the place where it was actually coming from and the specific reassurance it would take to address it. And when Fenrath paused, she said simply and directly what that reassurance was and how it could be formalized in a way that served both parties. Fenrath looked at her. Then he looked at Kaelor. "She's right," Kaelor said. Fenrath took a moment. Then he nodded. That was the beginning of it. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, not marked by any formal declaration beyond the one that had already happened in the center of the hall with 300 witnesses. Just the ordinary, ongoing business of a palace that had a great deal of work to do and two people who were going to do it together. And the long, slow process of everyone inside it adjusting to what that meant. Later, much later, after Fenrath and the other 40 people had been addressed, and the hall had finally emptied and the candles had burned lower, and the palace had moved into the particular quiet of the very late hour, Kaelor found her in the upper corridor again. She was at the window. She had come back to it because she had needed 5 minutes of stillness, and the view of the city and the mountains was the most honest thing available in the palace at that hour. He stood beside her. The city below was quieter now. The mountains were the same. The moon had moved across the sky in the way it always did, indifferent to everything beneath it, performing its ancient function with the complete consistency of something that had been doing its job long before the palace was built and would continue long after. "My mother needs to be given proper quarters," Elira said. "Not the healer's wardrooms, actual quarters. She's been in that ward for 19 years. "Done," he said. "And I want access to the war room, not as a guest, as someone with standing to be there." "Done," he said. "And I want—" She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at the city. "I want to go back to the training yard," she said. "Not tonight, but I want to keep running the patterns. I've been running them for 5 weeks, and I'm better than I was, and I'm not done yet." He was quiet for a moment. "You're 9th," he said, and she could hear the specific, restrained quality in his voice that she had learned to recognize as the thing that happened when he was keeping something from being audible. "In a tournament that's technically still running for another 12 hours. "I know," she said. "You could finish," he said. "The ball is concluded. The formal selection was made. But the tournament standings technically remain active until the morning announcement. If you presented to the assessors before dawn, I don't need the standing," she said. "No," he said, "but you earned it." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression that had no precise name, the one she had started watching for in the 2nd week and had stopped trying to categorize in the 3rd because some things were better held than classified. "You came to this yard 5 weeks ago," she said, "and you told a woman who was trying to confess to the wrong person that she should enter a tournament she was probably going to lose." "Yes," he said. "You were right about the losing," she said. "I was wrong about the tournament," he said. "You didn't lose it. You won something it wasn't designed to give." She held that. She thought about 22 years of invisible. She thought about the wrong door and the right room. She thought about a cup of tea that went cold, and sweat on packed dirt, and a split lip from Vera Kane in 40 seconds, and page 37, and her mother's 2 sentences, and Seraphine in a corridor choosing her own line. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not managed, not positioned, not used as a political variable or a diplomatic asset or a convenient disruption to someone else's correct choices, but actually seen. To have someone look at you with the full weight of their attention and find, in what they saw, something worth protecting without making it smaller in the protecting. She had spent 22 years waiting for that without knowing she was waiting for it. It had come through the wrong door. Most true things did. "Run the patterns with me tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the window. He stood beside her. The mountains held their positions. The city breathed below them. The moon continued its indifferent and ancient work across the sky. The palace breathed around them, restless, layered, full of the accumulated weight of every decision and every life that had moved through its corridors since the first stone was laid. It did not care about them specifically. It had not been built for her and would not reshape itself because she had arrived. It would continue, as it always had, indifferent to the people navigating its interior. But she had learned something, over 5 weeks of navigating it, that she had not known at the beginning. Indifferent did not mean immovable. The palace could be navigated, it could be learned, its levers could be found, and its footnotes read, and its corridors memorized, and its gap between correct and right understood. It could be entered through the wrong door and still arrived at. She had done all of that. She was still here. The sun came up eventually, as it always did, over the mountains and the city and the palace of Valderis, and it found 2 people standing at a window in the upper corridor, not performing anything for anyone, not managing an outcome or calculating a consequence or holding a position in any room that required it. Just standing, side by side, watching the light come back, which was, in the end, the only honest thing left to do after a very long night. The empire had a queen. The king had found his footing. And Elira Voss, daughter of a healer who had walked through the wrong door 22 years into a life of careful invisibility, had discovered what she had always suspected and never quite believed, that the things built to last are not built from correct choices. They are built from true ones. And truth, unlike correctness, does not require anyone's permission to stand.